Arratsaldeon guztioi. Oain zuekin, Jose Ignacio Espel, presidente del Aquarium. Txalo bero bat berarentzat mesedez.
Egun on, eta ongi etorri Aquariumera. Buenos días y bienvenidos al Aquarium. Good morning, welcome to the Aquarium. Es un placer dar comienzo a este simposio sobre naturaleza y arte en este centenario Aquarium, y hacerlo ante autoridades a quienes agradezco especialmente su presencia y ante el magnífico equipo de ponentes y participantes. En primer lugar, quisiera felicitar a Cristina por su obra, porque como hemos comprobado ya en la visita, es bellísima y su sonido me ha maravillado. Y sobre todo por el mensaje que, tras la obra, trae el deseo de despertar en nuestra conciencia la necesidad de proteger los fondos marinos, nuestro entorno natural y las especies que lo habitan. Este simposio, iniciativa de la propia Cristina, nos muestra también su interés por ahondar en la divulgación, interés que compartimos con este Aquarium. Desde nuestros orígenes, en 1908, hace ya casi 115 años, la educación y la divulgación ha sido siempre una constante en esta sociedad. Esta vocación se hizo realidad en enero de 1912, fecha en la que el Aquarium inició la primera escuela de náutica y de pesca de todo el Estado español. Su objetivo era mejorar la seguridad, la calidad de vida y los conocimientos de los pescadores. Asimismo, creó una especie de seguros mutuos que cuando se producía un accidente, las viudas y huérfanos recibían ayudas de prestaciones públicas que distribuía el propio Aquarium. Hemos acudido, y ahora seguimos haciéndolo, a diversos centros para divulgar el mensaje de conservación y preservación de los ecosistemas marinos. Más allá de nuestras instalaciones, no debemos olvidar tampoco el Máster de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Marinos que celebramos junto a varias universidades y en especial con la UPV y ASTI, quienes también son parte activa de este simposio. Espero que sea fructífero este simposio y que nuestro último objetivo, que es la conservación del entorno marino, sea tenido cada vez más en cuenta en las políticas medioambientales. Eskerrik asko y bienvenidos a todos.
Eskerrik asko, Espel jauna. Ongi etorriak izan zaitezte Donostia Sustainability Forumen barruan, ospatuko dugun bi eguneko simposium honetara. Plazer bada guretzat, kostalde harritxua, geologia, ekologia eta eskultura izenpean hainbat aditu eta itzalandiko pertsonak biltzeko aukera izatea. La escultura ondalea de la artista Cristina Iglesias, ubicada en la isla de Santa Clara y que ha sido encargo del Ayuntamiento de Donostia, se inaugurará el día 5, el Día Mundial del Medio Ambiente. Pero esto, por supuesto, no es fruto de la casualidad, sino más bien de la causalidad, porque la obra resuena e inspira este simposio, donde diferentes expertos compartirán sus pensamientos y reflexiones acerca del diálogo que se establece entre el arte, la literatura, la geología y la ecología. Iglesias ha creado nuevas formas de escultura pública que invitan a replantearse los límites existentes o quizás inexistentes entre el arte y la naturaleza y exhorta al público a acceder a lo invisible a través de la experiencia propia, como lo consigue con esta obra, estableciendo los parámetros para un viaje que siempre será único y original para cada persona. Those of us here have had the privilege of visiting Ondalia with the artist herself just a few hours ago, but we welcome each and every one of you who are following us online throughout this common journey that begins today, the first day of the symposium. Remember that simultaneous translation is available in 3 languages, Basque, Spanish and English. Recuerden que tienen traducción simultánea en 3 idiomas. Thank you very much for being part of the Rocky Coast, Geology, Ecology, Sculpture. Antolatzaileen izenean, Donostiako Udala eta Donostia Sustainability Forumaren sustatzailea den Euskal Herriko Unibertsitateko Uda ikastaroen eskutik, gure esker ona azaldu nahi diogu jakina simposio hau posible egin duten guztiei, porque esto, sin duda, no sería posible sin la generosidad de nuestros colaboradores. BBA Fundazioa, IOB Eusko Jaurlaritzako ekonomiaren garapen, jasangarritasun eta ingurumeneko sailaren herri baltzua, Gipuzkoako Foru Aldundiko ingurumena eta obra hidraulikoetako departamentuari ere eskerrik asko, eta jakina nola ez, bere goitzan hartu gaituen Donostiako akuariumari. Mila esker. Permitidme que a continuación os introduzca a las personas que representan a las instituciones y fundaciones que han respaldado este curso, este simposio, para que lo inauguren oficialmente. Horretarako, holtzara deituko ditugu. Eneko Goya, Markel Olano, Arantxa Tapia, Agustin Erkizia eta Silvia Txurruka. Zuekin, Eneko Goya, Donostiako alkatea, txalo bero bat berarentzat mesedez.
Agintariak, erretore orde jauna lagunak, arratsaldeon eta ongietorriak guztiak Donostiako akuarium honetara eskerrik asko Jose Ignacio egiten diguzun harrera beroagatik. Hori egin nahi dut denik eta behin, eskerrak eman nahi dizkiot akuariumari ondadea eskuartze artistikoaren inguruan antolatu den simposium hau bere egoitzan egiteko eskaini digun aukera eta prestutasunagatik. Aldi berean, eskerrak eman nahi dizkiot Euskal Herriko Unibertsitateari, bere udako ikastaroen programan jaso duedako honako topaketa akademiko hau. Eskerrak ere, IOB agentziari eta Eusko Jaurlaritzako zein Gipuzkoako Foru Aldundiko ingurumen sailei euren babesa ere garrantzitsua izan delako gogoeta foro hau bultzatu ahal izateko. Del mismo modo, quiero agradecer a la Fundación BBVA por su apoyo y patrocinio, lo que confiere a este encuentro de una calidad y una dimensión muy relevantes. I also would like to thank to the different guests who are with us those 2 days. I hope that the different dialogues among us will enrich and inspire all of us. Cuando comenzamos a trabajar el proyecto de Ondadea en la Casa del Faro de la isla Santa Clara, Cristina Iglesias nos trasladó que su obra buscaba no solo crear una escultura en un lugar simbólico y único. Cristina quería crear una experiencia que acompañase a la contemplación de la escultura, la vivencia del viaje en barco, la llegada a la isla, la subida al faro, el disfrute de la obra con sus imágenes y sonidos poderosos y el propio paseo por la isla son elementos que acompañan y enriquecen la experiencia de Ondadea. Pero más allá de esto, Cristina nos trasladó que su obra buscaba además provocar una reflexión. El cuidado de la naturaleza, la conservación de nuestros mares y océanos, son ideas que están presentes en el universo de Cristina. No solo en Ondadea, sino a lo largo de su ya dilatada y brillante trayectoria. Cuestiones todas ellas muy en boga en todo el mundo y que Donostia, como ciudad que vive del mar, que vive con el mar, que vive en el mar, quiere contribuir humildemente a reflexionar. Gogoratu nahi dut, besteak beste artista gutxik izango zutela Kristinak duela urte batzuk izan zuen ausardia. Arteldan bat itsasoaren ondoan eraikitzen, Baja Californiako Mar de Cortesen duen eskultura, hain zuzen ere. Posiblemente Ondadea dialogue a través de misteriosas corrientes marinas con la escultura que Cristina instaló en las profundidades del Mar de Cortés, en Baja California. De alguna manera ambas obras están conectadas por el mar. El agua es un elemento clave y presente en la obra de Cristina que aflora en muchas de sus creaciones. En las 3 aguas de Toledo, en Forgotten Streams de Londres, en su Deep Fountain de Amberes, en las estancias sumergidas del Mar de Cortés y, cómo no, en Ondadea, aquí, en Donostia. Las esculturas vegetales, líquidas y rocosas de Cristina constituyen un universo único, original, particular y muy hermoso. Gaur hemen hasiko dugun simposium hau, aukera ezin hobea da Kristinak piztu duen gogoetari heltzeko. Gure kostak, Euskal Herriko kostak, duen balioa, duen aberastasuna, duen historia, bere geologiak ematen digun informazioa eta gaur egungo egoera. Eta horrek guztiak artearekin eta eskulturarekin duen lotura eta den inspirazio iturria aztergai izango dira hemen. Artea eta gogoeta akademikoa eta zientifikoa eskutik helduta. Donostian, Ondadearen aitzakiz. Uste dut benetan aukera ezin hobea dela, izlarien eta parte hartzaileen maila ikusita, ondadean aurkezpenak gure egunotan hainbeste garrantzia hartu duen gai hau jorratzeko eta mundu akademikoan zein artistikoan bide berriak eta inspirazio bide berriak eraikitzeko. Eskerrik asko guztioi eta topaketa aberasgarria izan dadila.
Eskerrik asko, alkate jauna. Un fuerte aplauso para Silvia Churruca, directora de Comunicación y Relaciones Institucionales de la Fundación BBVA.
Buenas tardes. Primero quiero agradecer, por un lado, al Aquarium de San Sebastián por acogernos en este punto, yo creo que totalmente neurálgico de la ciudad y que es el mejor escenario posible quizá para este simposio. Agradecer también a Cristina Iglesias por la increíble experiencia que hemos podido disfrutar esta mañana. Lo comentábamos algunos de los que lo hemos visitado. ¿Cómo es posible en un lugar acotado reflejar la esencia del mar? Es una experiencia de verdad emotiva y emocionante. Muchas gracias, Cristina, porque es una obra impresionante. Y gracias a todas las autoridades y a quienes hacen posible este simposio, en el que la Fundación BBVA está encantada de colaborar, porque realmente creo que aquí aunamos muchos de los grandes objetivos que todos tenemos en común al servicio de la sociedad, tanto instituciones y administraciones públicas como privadas. Y a través del conocimiento, de la cultura y de la emoción, transmitir cuáles son los grandes retos a los que estamos afrontando como humanidad. La conservación de la biodiversidad, de los océanos, y también poder ser capaces de analizarlo desde un punto de vista de rigor científico, pero también de transmitirlo a través de la cultura. Esa unión entre conocimiento, ciencia y cultura es algo que para la Fundación BBVA está presente en todas y cada una de nuestras actividades. Cuando se nos propuso colaborar de alguna manera en esta iniciativa, vimos que efectivamente el simposio era el lugar natural para participar, para contribuir. Y además con la feliz coincidencia de que contábamos con uno de los galardonados de los premios Fundación BBVA Fronteras del Conocimiento, como es Carlos Duarte, que nos acompaña, que es una de las grandes voces del conocimiento científico sobre los océanos. Nos parecía que era una aportación sustancial a lo que aquí se pudiera decir. Ha llegado el momento, ya podemos, dentro de poco el público en general podrá disfrutar de la obra de Cristina Iglesias, pero creo que es un magnífico preámbulo antes de conocer la obra, el poder analizar, reflexionar sobre cuál es la situación de los océanos, cómo lo ve el pensamiento de la cultura y qué nos puede enseñar el conocimiento científico. Así que yo invitaría a todos a disfrutar, a participar, a seguir el simposio para llegar a la obra con algo en mente que se haya madurado previamente, ¿no? Muchas gracias a todos por la oportunidad que se ha ofrecido a la Fundación de participar en este evento y solo recomendar que visiten y que disfruten y se emocionen con la obra de Cristina. Muchas gracias.
Eskerrik asko, Churruca anderea. Zuekin jarraian, Agustin Erkizia jauna Euskal Herriko Unibertsitateko Gipuzkoako kampuseko errektore ordea.
Donostiako alkate jauna, Gipuzkoako diputatu nagusi jauna, Ekonomiaren garapen eta lehiakortasun sailburu Andrea, BBVA Fundazioko komunikazio eta erakunde harremanen zuzendari Andrea, jaun Andreok, lagunok, egunon guztioi. Unibertsitate jardueran, unibertsitate bat, oro har edo gure bezalako unibertsitate bat, Euskal Herriko Unibertsitatea, Donostiarren Unibertsitatea eta Gipuzkoaren Unibertsitatea, pentsatzen dugunean herritar gehienei burura heldu zaien lehenengo gauza irakaskuntza da. Unibertsitateak irakatse egiten du, hori da lehenengo pentsamendua. Hala ere, zorionez gero eta jende gehiago aipatzen du bigarren jarduera bat. Ikerketa aurrekoa bezain garrantzitsua. Eta unibertsitate jarduerari adi erreparatzen dioten personek gaur egungo unibertsitatean garrantzitsuak diren beste jarduera batzuk ere aipatzen dituzte. Hala nola, jakintzaren transferentzia eta zientziaren divulgazioa. Edonola ere, ziur pertsona horietako askok ez dute artea aipatuko, sorkuntza artistikoa. Seguru asko, artea ez da agertzen leku nabarmen batean unibertsitate lana deskribatzen denean edo gure jarduera edukiz bete behar denean. Ostera, paradoxikoa bada ere, artea unibertsitatearen jardueraren muinetako bada. Beti izan da, arte plastikoetatik hasita adiera zorrotzenean, unibertsitateko kide batek erakustean, ikertzean edo gogoeta egiten garatu behar duen sormenera. Gaurko ekitaldian, egokia iruditu zait aldarrikapen hori egitea. Ekitaldi honekin, Cristina Iglesiasen obra berriaren inguruko bi gogoeta eguna hasten dira. Ekitaldi bat, hemen, UPVH-ko UD ikastaroetan antolatu duguna, kostalde harritsua, Geologia, Ekologia, Escultura lemapean. Ez dago niri jakina obraren esana izakona interpretatzea. Bai ordea, iradokitzen didana edo iradokitzen diguna adieraztea. Izan ere, unibertsitatea foro bat da eta hasiera nioen moduan haren xedea erakustea eta ikertzea ez ezik, sortzea, imaginatzea eta artearen inguruan gogoeta egitea ere bada. Hace tiempo que Cristina Iglesias se ha embarcado en intervenciones artísticas audaces, en las que la naturaleza y el arte se combinan. El título de este simposio se orienta en esa misma dirección, Geología, Ecología, Escultura. Y nos indica en buena parte el sentido de esa nueva intervención. El faro de la isla de Santa Clara era todo un símbolo de Donostia, pero al mismo tiempo una construcción arrinconada por el desuso y el abandono. Ahora recobra un nuevo valor a través de una intervención artística que no se dirige a eliminar los recursos naturales del entorno, sino a contemplarlos desde una luz distinta, a reinventarlos, a utilizarlos, en suma, de una nueva manera. Creo que la acción que ha concebido la escultura donostiarra deposita una nueva mirada sobre uno de nuestros símbolos y suscitará en las personas que vayan a visitar el faro una respuesta sentimental y emocional. Me parece que nos hallamos ante una obra extraordinaria, una obra que combina, como decía, la naturaleza y la cultura. Para la Universidad del País Vasco, la Universidad Donostiarra y Guipuzcoana, como he dicho antes, es un honor acoger este simposio porque el arte también tiene su sitio, un sitio grande en nuestra actividad. Eskerrik asko zuen arretagatik.
Eskerrik asko, Erkizia jauna. Zuek guztiokin orain Arantxa Tapia anderea, ekonomiaren garapen, jasangarritasun eta ingurumeneko sailburua. Txalo bero bat beraren zan mesedez.
Eta lagunok egunon guztioi. Eskerrik asko bi pertsona bereziei gaur, Jose Ignacio hemen hartatzen gaituzuelako, eta Cristina zure obragatik. Bi egun garrantzitsua hausnartzeko, hain zuzen ere ingurumenaren nazioarteko egunean inaugurazio ofizialaren aurretik. Uste dut, nolabait, erabaki paregabea izan dela. Kostalde harritsua, geologia, ekologia, eskultura. Hauxe da simposium honen izenburua. Bertan, artearen, geologiaren eta ekologiaren arteko pentsamentuak partekatu eta lantzeko aukera paregabea. Naturarekiko grina sortzeko aukera eta transmititzeko. Eta elkarren artean behar diren bi esfera kultural horiek lan egin dezaten, elkarrekin bizi daitezen eta esperientziak truka ditzaten. Espazio horretan artistek eta zientzialariak behatu eta sortu egiten dute. Naiz eta kultur esparru ezberdinetakoak diren, elkarrekin egiten dute lan. Batzuetan kasualitateak hurbiltzen ditu. Beste batzuetan berriz, elkarrekin urteetan egindako lan sakonak elkartzen ditu. Jardunaldi honen helburua, helburuetako bat behintzat, bi arlo horiek nahita hurbiltzea izan da. Elkarren artean behar den ulermena lantzea. Batzuek sorkuntzarekin aurrera egiteko eta beste batzuek berriz ezagutza hobetu eta komunikatu ahal izateko. Batak eta besteak informazioz gainezka daude eta naturarekiko harremanetan sakondu dituzten balioak aztertuko dituzte, baino baita ere partekatu beraien artean eta gizartearekin, gu guztiokin. Irrikitan gaude hori jakiteko eta guztiona iristeko. Euskadik duela gutxi modu ofizialean jakitea eman du Europako itun berdearekin bat egiten duela. Estrategia horrek Basque Green Deal du izena Europarekin bat egiten duenez. Eta besteak beste, iraunkortasunaren irizpideetan sentsibilizatu eta zabaltzeko lanean sakondu nahi dugu. Garapen eredu inklusiboa alde batetikan eta ingurumenarekiko jasangarria izan dadin bultzatzen eta lantzen ari gera. Testu inguru horretan, Eusko Jaurlaritzak bat egin du aurrerantzean, hor agertzen den izen batekin. Donostia Sustainability Forum Basque Green Deal delako foro honekin. Euskal Herriko Unibertsitateko udako ikastaroen eta IOBeren arteko hitzarmenaren bitartez. Espero dugu hemendikan aurrera ere, Agustin, benetan lan sakona egingo deula. Eskerrik asko zuri eta itziarrei ere. Un acuerdo entre el Gobierno vasco y los cursos de verano para impulsar la colaboración con este nuevo Donostia Sustainability Forum, con este nuevo foro que se crea para generar esos espacios de divulgación, para que ese Basque Green Deal sea conocido, sea interiorizado, con el objetivo de acercar la realidad del reto ambiental a la ciudadanía en general. Y para ser capaces de mostrar al exterior que nuestra apuesta por la convivencia de todos los factores que resultan imprescindibles en el devenir de Euskadi tienen que trabajarse de forma conjunta. El Basque Green Deal asume el reto de dotar de un liderazgo ambiental a todas nuestras actividades, al propio desarrollo del país. Una visión ambiental que de manera transversal absolutamente a todas nuestras actividades contempla entre sus líneas de actuación la lucha contra el cambio climático, la transición energética, la economía circular, la conservación del patrimonio natural, la ordenación de los recursos naturales y la conservación de la naturaleza. Una pieza clave para conseguir este reto tiene que ser una apuesta decidida por la educación, por la sensibilización, por la concienciación ambiental de todos y de todas. No consiste solo en hacer más y mejor, sino en profundizar en la conciencia de todo lo que hacemos. Hondalea es un claro ejemplo de ello. Una experiencia que aúna capacidad de observación, de sentimiento, de interactuar con la naturaleza y con el ser humano al mismo tiempo. Hondalea esperientzia sakona da. Zein gozagarria, zein sakona, biak aldi berean. Gizakiaren eta naturaren arteko elkar bizitza eta solasaldia partekatzen ditu. Disfruta dezagun hondaleaz. Eskerrik asko.
Eskerrik asko, Tapia anderea. Eta inaugurazioni itxiera emateko, Markel Olano jauna dugu, Gipuzkoako diputatu nagusia. Txalo bero bat.
Egun guztioi, niretzako ohorea da, zu guztiekin partekatzea Simposio honen hasiera. Eta ohorea da, bereziki gaia oso atsegin dudalako, eta gainera atzo hondalea ezagutzeko aukera eduki nuelako, eta gainera bere autorearen, Cristina Iglesiasen eskutik egin nuelako, beraz, privilegio handi horrek oraindik ere soka ekartzen di gaurko egunera. El guipuzcoano, el vasco en general, tiene fama de ser reservado, de no expresar públicamente sus sentimientos, y por eso seguramente más de uno se quedó un poco impactado, y me lo dijo además cuando ayer expresé mi sentimiento y mi emoción después de la visita. Me dijeron, joder, el diputado general se ha emocionado, se nos ha emocionado, ¿no? Y lo cierto es que luego pensando por qué se había producido esa emoción y por qué la expresé,
bueno, pues conecto con el simposio de hoy y su título, ¿no? Y el hecho de que aúna, desde la perspectiva de la costa vasca, tres ámbitos, tres conceptos como son el de la geología, la ecología y la escultura. Y bueno, escuchándole ayer a Cristina, hablaba de que su fuente de inspiración de la obra de Ondalea pues estaba en dos espacios naturales del territorio como son el FLIS, ¿no? El geoparque, y por otro lado la costa en Jaizkibel, ¿no? El mar, las formaciones en Jaizkibel que, bueno, pues al final se observan también en la propia obra. Además, me decía Sir Hilario que de un modo contradictorio, porque eso no se produce en la naturaleza, esa unión entre esas dos formaciones. Bien, son dos espacios especialmente queridos por mí, ¿no? En Zumaya y en Hondarribia, que es mi localidad en la que vivo actualmente, aunque soy del Goierri y del interior. Por lo tanto, soy de adopción costero y por eso seguramente a lo mejor aprecio tanto la belleza de un territorio y de unas formaciones geológicas que seguramente los que viven y los que han nacido en Donostia o en otras villas de la costa, pues igual lo viven de un modo más natural. Para mí tienen un impacto emocional especialmente importante. Orduan hori da pixkat, ez? Azkenean dauka zerikusia, emozioarekin dauka zerikusia, estetikarekin dauka zerikusia, artearekin, baina baita ere gure naturarekin. Ez nijo errepikatzea zenbait kontzeptu niretzako funtsezkoak direnak. Bakarrik esan, gure arteak, arte garaikideak, horrelakoak Kristinak egin duen bezala, behin eta berriro egin dituela, ez? Eta nik eredu batzuk jartzeagatik niretzako funtsezkoa da, adibidez, Oteizak arantzazun egindakoa, ez? Friso hori, ez, apostuluekin egindakoa, hori nola txertatzen dan arantzazun naturak hainbeste impacto, hainbeste presentzia daukan leku batean. Oteizak berak aginan, lesakan, Aiako harriei begira egin zuen Aita Donosti ere egindako estela edo hilarri hori, ezaguna dena, impacto estetiko handio dena, baita ere dialogo horretan, ez, artea eta natura. Eta noski baita ere, txillidaren, haizearen horazia, hori atzo ere aipatzen genuen, nola Oteizarekin, eskulturarekin batera dialogoan dagoen Ondalearekin. Ez beraz, horrek ere naturaren eta itsasoaren presentzi zuzena dukita, hor ikusten da benetan kontzeptu hori, ez? Geologia, natura eta artea eta eskultura eskutik joan direla gure arte garaikidean azkeneko urte luzeetan, eta Kristinak urrengo esponente nabarmena inauguratzen du egun hauetan Ondalearen eskutik. Beraz, Simposio honek gaia ezartzen du, puntua ezartzen du oso modu berezian, interes handikoa, eta espero dut, eta desio dut, bi egun hauetan asko ikasiko dugula, eta asko disfrutatuko dugula baita ere. Eskerrik asko guztioi.
Eskerrik asko, Olano jauna, eskerrik asko, jaun Andreok, zuen ekarpenengatik, nahi dezunean mesedez, eskerrik asko. A continuación, para aquellas personas que quizá nos estén siguiendo online y todavía no hayan tenido, como comentábamos una y otra vez, ¿no?, el privilegio de visitar in situ y disfrutar Ondalea, hemos preparado un vídeo que es un teaser que forma parte del guide tour de Ondalea que tiene por título 7B Ondalea. Y bueno, por lo menos os queríamos dar algo para que vayáis imaginando lo que puede suponer y el impacto positivo que luego generará la visita en persona. Gozatu dezazuela. The program has been directed by 3 experts from different disciplines, who are James Lingwood, co-director and founder of Artangel, Adolfo Uriarte Villalba, Natural Heritage and Climate Change of the Basque Government, and Manuel Soto, Deputy Director of Research Center for Experimental Marine Biology and Biotechnology, Plencia Marine Station. We feel honored to open the conference with James Lingwood. Mr. Lingwood is co-director of Artangel, an arts agency based in London that commissions and presents exceptional art in unexpected places. Artangel worked with Cristina Iglesias on her site-specific project, Tres Aguas in Toledo, and has been an advisor in Ondalea. Mr. Lingwood, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Firstly, on behalf of those of us who've traveled from overseas, from as far away as Los Angeles and New York, as well as London and elsewhere, thank you all for your very warm welcome to this wonderful city. So, the title of this symposium, The Rocky Coast, comes from a chapter in a book by the great American environmentalist, Rachel Carson, perhaps best known for her book Silent Spring, which in the early 1960s heralded the emergence of a new consciousness about the devastating damage being done to the environment by human activity. Rachel Carson's understanding of the intricate entanglements of ecology was actually formed a decade earlier on the Atlantic coast of North America in Maine. She was first and foremost a marine biologist, and she spent much of the 1950s immersed in and enchanted by the teeming life where the land meets the sea. And in her book, The Edge of the Sea, published in 1955, she describes, with the eye of a scientist and the heart of a poet, the different kinds of shorelines around the world. And of these, the Rocky Coast is perhaps the one that's closest to Carson's heart. She describes this coastline as a place of unrest. And in the rock pools of the shoreline, she finds worlds in themselves, full of life and rarely still. This is what she wrote, and she could be describing Ondalea. In the low places, little pools and gutters are left where the water trickles and gurgles and cascades in miniature waterfalls, and many of the dark caves between and under the rocks are floored with still mirrors, holding the reflection of delicate creatures. And the rocky coast ends with the writer standing on a rock in a cave, reflecting on this place where the deep time of geology meets the twice daily movement of the tides, advancing and receding, covering and uncovering. In the hidden chamber of that pool, Carson writes, time echoes down the long ages to a present that is but a moment. She is standing, she feels, where sentient life began. Now today, we're on a different rocky coast, in Donostia, San Sebastian, in the Bay of Biscay, to reflect on another extraordinary work inspired by, in part formed by, the particular characteristics of this ever-changing place where the sea meets the rock, made by the artist Cristina Iglesias, who, as we've heard, spent her formative years here in the city, on the coast, by an often rough sea, sometimes dreaming about the rocky outcrop of Santa Clara, a few minutes away by boat, but somehow remote from the daily rhythms of the city, with its lighthouse flashing out both a warning and a welcome. Inside the lighthouse, absorbed by the forms and sounds and movements of Christina's sculpture for the first time, my experience was not unlike that of Rachel Carson's, looking at a pool in a cave with time echoing around the chamber. Ondolea, the title, an old Basque word suggested by the Basque poet Beñat Sarasola, and apparently very hard to translate, but an approximation in English is marine abyss, generates a kind of dark enchantment. The rhythms of the work, its evocation of the different times of geology, of ecology, and of sculpture, hold you in the chamber, slow you down as you move around its geomorphic forms, look at it, listen to it. Ondolea is an invitation to us to reflect on questions that Rachel Carson was already asking 70 years ago, and on warnings that we have, by and large, as a society, not responded to, and which have become ever more urgent as we stare into the abyss. In English, we often say stare into the abyss as a metaphor for facing great danger. But the abyss is not something you can ever really see. It's too deep and too dark. It exists within the imagination. And perhaps the greatest achievement of Ondolea is not only that we marvel at the complexity of the cast forms and how closely they resemble geology, and wonder at the encounter between the bronze rock and the crashing, cascading water inside this house on top of the island. But perhaps its greatest achievement is to make us reflect on what lies beyond what we can see and in what we can only imagine. What is the place of the imagination in the urgent debate about ecology and the environment, the abyss of the climate crisis? How does a work such as Ondolea, that operates on the level of the imaginary and the symbolic as much as the experiential, speak to a growing ecological consciousness, perhaps to a geological consciousness? So over the course of this afternoon and tomorrow morning, we have a group of preeminent speakers who will consider these and no doubt many other questions located at the intersection of geology, ecology, and sculpture. And the shape of this symposium reflects the hope that my colleagues in shaping this, Adolfo Uriarte, Manuel Soto, Lourdes Fernandez, and of course Cristina Iglesias, our hope that these different fields of research and knowledge, with their long histories and often connected histories and fields of knowledge, can speak to each other in productive and inspiring ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lingwood, for your words and for leading, together with Uriarte and Soto, such an important program. Hasi gaitezen ba, bi egunetako lehenbiziko mintzaldiarekin. Datorren gonbidatua, aditua, Asier Hilario Oruz dugu, geologian doktorea da, eta bere jarduera profesionala batez ere Euskal Kostaldeko UNESCOren munduko geoparkeari lotuta dago. Egun, nazioarteko zientzia geologikoen elkarteko ondare geologikoaren batzordeko presidentea ere bada. Bere jarduera nagusia lurraren zientzien komunikazioarekin, nazioarteko ondare geologikoarekin, katalogazioarekin eta geoparkeen edapenarekin lotuta dago. Europako Geoparkeko sareko zuzendaritza batzordeko kidea da, UNESCO munduko geoparkeen programarako ebaluatzaile gisa egiten du lana, eta nazioarteko zientzia geologikoen programaren batzorde zientifikoaren kidea da. Entzun dezagun bere hitzaldia, lurraren memoriaren obra artea. Txalo bero bat berarentzat.
Eskerrik asko guztioi, entzuten zait ondo? Bai. Bueno, ze ohore handia hemen gaur egotea, ez? Ze topaketa polita, ze topaketa ederra, ze aukera ona daukagu gaur hemen pertsona desberdinak elkar ikusteko, ez? Ondalea, ze izen polita, ondalea, ze izen benetan euskara ulertzen dugunak, ondalea, ze izen polita, ze ondo asmatutako izena. For those following us online, I'd like to tell you that this morning I had a chance to go to the island of Santa Clara. Specifically, I had the chance to go to the lighthouse of the island of Santa Clara. I'm a geologist. I've spent half of my life studying and communicating the value of the cliffs, the geological value of the cliffs of the Basque Coast. I have had the chance to travel around. I have seen many different things, geological things. And I can promise you that I have never seen something like what I have seen this morning in the lighthouse of Santa Clara. Ondalea, it's something different. It's fantastic. It's based in geology, but it's something absolutely different. So just I would like to give you my most sincere welcome to one of the most impressive geological outcrops of the world. I'd like to give my most sincere welcome to one of the most, I would say, special pieces of art from the deep time, because this is the memory of the Earth. Hasteko, gustatuko litzaidake esker onak ematea, no puedo empezar de otra manera más que agradeciendo que me hayan dado la presencia de hoy estar aquí para hablar sobre geología, para hablar sobre las rocas que me gustan a mí. Y para eso quiero dar especial agradecimiento a dos personas, a Cristina, porque se haya fijado en estas rocas, porque se haya inspirado en estas rocas y porque haya visto que detrás de esas formas especiales, detrás de esos caprichos que nos enseñan estas rocas, hay una geología, hay una ciencia, y ha querido que esa ciencia esté presente hoy. Y por el mismo motivo me gustaría también agradecer a Adolfo Uriarte, pues porque quiso que la geología hoy estuviera presente aquí, no solamente en imágenes, sino también en palabras. Bueno, yo soy geólogo, ya lo he dicho creo que 3 veces en 5 minutos que llevo de charla, y eso quiere decir que me gusta lo que soy, me gusta la geología, I love geology. Benetan gustatu egite zait geologia. Geologiak emandik niri aukera munduan zehar bidaiatzeko, emandit aukera paisaiak, horrelako paisaiak, beste modu batean ikusteko. Koloreak, formak, pentsatzeko. Paisaiak beste modu batean ikusi eta pentsatu. Urrutira joan eta urrutian gaudenean bertakoa beste begi batekin ikusteko aukera. Baina zalantzarik gabe, yo no tengo ninguna duda de que a mí lo que más me ha impresionado siempre, el motivo por el que yo decidí dedicarme a esto, han sido las montañas. No hay para mí nada equiparable al poder que tienen las montañas en lugares como este, por ejemplo, en el Karakorum, que tuve la oportunidad de estar hace algunos años. En estos lugares uno se siente pequeño. En estos lugares uno empieza a comprender cuál es la magnitud del tiempo que hace falta para esculpir obras de arte como estas, que tienen 5.000 metros de desnivel, en una roca de granito, que es una roca dura. Rocas que se han formado a 5 kilómetros de profundidad, en una gran bolsa de magma. Cuando uno se pone delante de un paisaje poderoso como este, empieza a comprender lo pequeños que somos y lo grande que es el tiempo geológico que hace falta para esculpir este tipo de paisajes. Baina nire mendiak ez dira horrelakoak. Mis montañas son montañas más cercanas, son montañas más pequeñitas, son montañas más redondeadas. Nik txikian nintzanean hemen pasatzen dituen udarak, hori Aralar da. Esas son las campas de Aralar, que es una cadena montañosa cercana, aquí, bueno, entre Guipúzcoa y Navarra. Y bueno, son montañas, son lo que son. Son montañas bonitas, son montañas redondeadas, son montañas muchas veces tapadas por las nieblas, y a mí eso me gusta mucho. Son montañas que muchas veces, aunque no sean muy altas, pero aparecen por encima de las nubes. A veces uno tiene esa posibilidad de caminar por encima de las nubes. Y esas montañas, cuando uno las mira con un poquito más de detalle, pues lo que va a ver es que esas rocas que forman esas montañas están formadas por fósiles marinos. Esta es una foto sacada en Aralar. Y esto lo que quiere decir es que esas rocas en algún momento se formaron debajo del mar y que hoy en día forman montañas de 1.000 metros de desnivel. Y eso lo que quiere decir es que las geografías cambian, los paisajes cambian. Igual que las civilizaciones van y vienen, los continentes van y vienen, las geografías cambian. Lo que antes era un mar, hoy puede ser una montaña. Esa percepción de que el fotograma que estamos viendo hoy en el paisaje no es más que el último de miles de fotogramas que le preceden para entender lo que tenemos delante, que las cosas no siempre han sido así, que antes de que llegáramos nosotros el mundo existía de la misma manera, pero era diferente. Esa percepción, si queréis más filosófica que científica, bueno, pues a mí me gusta. Y yo entiendo que bueno, pues aquellos paseos que yo daba con mis padres por esas montañas viendo estos fósiles, algo despertaron. Cuando uno entiende un poco esa magnitud del tiempo, pues entiende que incluso obras de arte como esta, que se hicieron hace unos 15.000 años en la cueva de Caín, aquellos antepasados nuestros que vivían en una realidad tan diferente a la que vivimos hoy, realmente nosotros, pero ellos también, somos unos absolutos recién llegados. Somos todavía una mera anécdota en la historia de la Tierra. Acabamos de llegar. Ahora, sí es verdad que en muy poco tiempo hemos tenido la capacidad de alterar absolutamente el medio en el que vivimos. Hay incluso gente, geólogos, científicos, que se atreven a llamarle a esta nueva era el Antropoceno. Bueno, este es un debate científico en el que no quiero entrar ahora. Lo que sí está claro es que en muy poco tiempo hemos tenido la capacidad de alterar absolutamente el medio en el que vivimos. Eso no lo hacía la gente que pintaba de Caín. Esto lo venimos haciendo en las últimas décadas, principalmente. Si queréis un poquito más, un siglo de tiempo atrás. Yo diría que además, recientemente, además de alterar profundamente el medio, de alterar algunos de los sistemas que hacen que el sistema Tierra funcione, yo diría que la globalización nos está haciendo perder identidad y nos está haciendo perder contacto con la naturaleza. Y este es un tema que creo que tiene interés hoy. Nos está haciendo perder esa conexión con la naturaleza. Soy geólogo y entiendo la geología. No entiendo de arte, pero me gusta. Me gusta, lo disfruto. Cuando puedo, consumo arte. Cuando puedo, voy a un museo. Seguramente me pierdo me pierdo casi todo lo que hay allí. Y entiendo la mitad de lo que veo, pero me gusta. Me hace sentirme bien. El arte nos ayuda a pensar, el arte nos ayuda a abrir la mente, el arte nos ayuda a ver otras cosas, a hacernos preguntas. Y esto, los que vivimos en Donosti lo sabemos muy bien. Hay lugares como este y algunos otros. El mar Cantábrico no sería el mismo si eso no estuviera ahí. Tiene otra dimensión, tiene otra manera, tiene otro color, tiene otra fuerza. ¿Sí? Por eso creo que el arte es un instrumento muy potente, muy válido, para comunicar lo que queremos comunicar desde el mundo de la ciencia. Yo creo que necesitamos construir esos puentes. Son puentes. Necesitamos construir esos puentes para entender el planeta en el que vivimos. Vivimos en un planeta que funciona de una manera determinada, que ha venido funcionando de una manera determinada durante miles de años, durante millones de años. Necesitamos entender cómo ha sido su funcionamiento, porque nosotros acabamos de llegar. Necesitamos entender que acabamos de llegar. No solo entender, asumirlo de verdad. Asumir que somos una mera anécdota, que estamos aquí desde antes de ayer y nada más que eso. Y como consecuencia de todo esto, necesitamos seriamente reconsiderar la manera en la que estamos en el mundo, la manera en la que estamos haciendo las cosas. Y esto necesitamos hacerlo con una buena comunicación que sea efectiva, una comunicación que sea afectiva. Si la comunicación no es afectiva, si la comunicación no toca los sentidos, si la comunicación no toca los sentimientos, no es tan efectiva, o es lo que a mí me parece. Y creo que en ese sentido, el arte, iniciativas como la que hoy celebramos aquí, pues son muy, muy, muy bienvenidas. Hay un principio en la interpretación del patrimonio, si queréis, de Freeman Tilden, que dice que interpretar no es tanto transmitir información, se trata de provocar. Hay que provocar algo, un interés, hay que provocar un sentimiento. Y creo que lugares como este realmente pueden provocar ese sentimiento. Bueno, Hondalea no está en cualquier lugar. Hondalea está dentro de un faro que está en una isla. Esto de por sí ya es algo especial. Una isla es una pieza separada del resto. Es una pieza separada del resto del continente, que es donde vivimos la mayoría de la gente. Pero si nos fijamos un poco más, vamos a ver que esta isla, bueno, vista desde arriba, tiene una forma determinada. Una forma determinada que yo diría aquí claramente que se ven una orientación de esta manera. Ese faro está construido sobre unas capas de roca que están orientadas de una manera determinada. Es una pieza aislada del continente, pero desde luego no está aislada del resto de la costa. Es una pieza más de un libro fantástico, de uno de los mejores libros que se ha escrito nunca sobre la historia de la Tierra, que es todos los afloramientos de flis, todas las capas de flis que tenemos en nuestra costa. Yo muchas veces suelo decir que esto es como si fuera un gran libro de la historia de la Tierra, en el que cada una de esas capas son las páginas de ese libro. Todas estas capas, que hoy en día vemos en posición vertical, se formaron entre hace más o menos 110 millones de años y hace 50 millones de años, o 40 y pico millones de años, en el fondo de un mar. Un fondo de un mar que separaba la península ibérica del continente europeo. Fijaros si los continentes cambian. Entre la península ibérica y el continente europeo había un mar, y debajo de ese mar se formaron sedimentos marinos. Sedimentos marinos llenos de fósiles marinos, como vamos a ver. Esas capas, esos fondos marinos, hoy en día los podemos ver de esta manera. Esto es una colección extraordinaria de fondos marinos, no es otra cosa. Miles y miles y miles de fondos marinos superpuestos uno encima del otro que hoy en día podemos ver caminando por los acantilados. Además, es un libro que, además de contar muchas cosas, es un libro espectacular. Es un libro bonito, es un libro estético, es un libro que llama la atención por las fotografías que da. A partir de este momento yo le he dado muchas vueltas a cómo enfocar lo que quería comunicar hoy. A partir de aquí, podía haber tirado de fotografías espectaculares, de lugares espectaculares del mundo, y todos nos hubiéramos quedado maravillados con lo bonito que es nuestro planeta, con el buen trabajo que ha hecho la naturaleza para llegar hasta donde estamos hoy. Pero pensé que no. Pensé que esta obra está inspirada en unas rocas determinadas. Esta obra está colocada sobre unas rocas determinadas, unas rocas que son, si me lo permitís, puro arte natural, y que tienen una historia que contar extraordinaria. Y eso es lo que me gustaría contaros hoy. No me interesa tanto la belleza que hay detrás de esas capas, de esa geometría que existe, que llama la atención, pero me interesa más el mensaje que hay detrás. Por ejemplo, fijarnos en cómo están ordenadas esas capas. Esas capas no están ordenadas de cualquier manera. Hay capas duras y hay capas blandas. Esto se ha formado poco a poco por decantación lenta de sedimentos en el fondo marino. Las capas duras son calizas, las capas blandas son margas. Y si nos fijamos, se alternan todo el rato una con la otra, una con la otra, una con la otra, una con la otra. Y cada 5 parejas más o menos vuelven a aparecer otras cosas. Vemos que ahí hay una especie de orden. No pretendo que ahora entendamos lo que es una cosa y la otra, pero vemos que ahí hay una especie de orden. Ese orden, si lo medimos, son ciclos de 20.000 años y ciclos de 100.000 años. Ese orden responde a los ciclos climáticos de la Tierra, que están controlados por movimientos astronómicos del eje de la Tierra y de la órbita de la Tierra en torno al Sol. ¿Por qué tenemos capas? ¿Por qué las capas se alternan de esa manera? Las capas se alternan de esa manera porque nos cuentan la historia del clima, que está controlado por la cantidad de energía que recibimos del Sol en función de la orientación, de la inclinación que tiene el eje de la Tierra o de la geometría que tiene la órbita de la Tierra en torno al Sol. Fijaros si el tema tiene recorrido. Claro, cuando entendemos que cada una de esas capas son 10.000 años, es una licencia, pero sirve, pues entonces entendemos que cuando uno camina por encima de esos acantilados, realmente está caminando sobre el tiempo profundo, que, si queréis, nuestros antepasados, los que pintaron en Ekain, apenas ocupan un par de capas, y que realmente la historia de la Tierra es algo que está lejos de un concepto que realmente podamos entender en su inmensidad. En este caso, pues solamente estaríamos hablando de que puede haber 4 o 5 millones de años, no más, cuando la Tierra tiene 4.500 millones de años. Pero realmente es un buen sitio para entender lo que es el tiempo profundo. Tener en cuenta que cada una de esas capas tiene aproximadamente 10.000 años. Es un libro que nos permite entrar dentro. Después ha venido el mar y ha generado recovecos como este, y que nos permite curiosear. Y a mí la curiosidad me parece que es una de las cosas que mueve las cosas buenas. La curiosidad es algo muy bueno, es algo que hay que fomentar, hay que hacerse preguntas. Y estos lugares donde la gente pues, puede entrar, puede mirar, puede tocar. Es un libro que se puede tocar. Bueno, hay algunos lugares espectaculares. Esto está en Heizkibel, por ejemplo. Hay verdaderas catedrales de arena. Algunas de esas capas no se formaron por decantación, sino que fueron grandes aludes. Fijaros, imaginaros qué pedazo de alud, qué gran alud tiene que bajar por un cañón submarino para finalmente dar un depósito pues, de 15 metros de arenas. Hay cosas muy bonitas, que además luego, cuando se alteran, empiezan a dar colores diferentes, empiezan a dar formas diferentes. La belleza de estas capas lo es a gran escala y lo es a pequeña escala. Cuando uno se fija en los detalles, estas capas están llenas de detalles. Fijaros, por ejemplo, una capa de estas de arena, la cantidad de láminas que tiene, que he visto que están muy bien reflejadas en la obra, la cantidad de láminas que tiene. Fijaros cómo estas láminas por la parte de aquí arriba se doblan hacia arriba. ¿Por qué se doblan hacia arriba? Esas son láminas, esas son estructuras de escape de agua. Cuando ese alud que baja por aquel cañón deposita esas arenas, las arenas se van sedimentando y el agua poco a poco escapa hacia arriba. Y cuando escapa hacia arriba nos da esa especie de formas. Y en la parte alta de la luz aquello es un caos. Y ese caos se ve muy bien reflejado en esta especie de formas que a mí me parecen tan bonitas. Y además son infinitas, hay miles de formas. No hay más que fijarse con un poquito de detalle. Además, esos fondos de vida, esos fondos marinos que hoy en día vemos en forma de capa, están llenos de vida de verdad. Algunas de esas capas tienen miles de huellas de animales que reptaban por aquel fondo marino arenoso, arcilloso, y que dejan huellas tan bonitas como estas. Muchas veces no sabemos cuál es el animal que hizo la huella, pero da igual. Son lugares que nos llaman la atención. Eran fondos marinos que tenían vida. Fijaros la vida, qué curiosa es. Algunas de esas huellas, esto mira qué escala tiene. Este se llama un icnofósil, una huella fósil, se llama Paleodiction. Esta es una de las huellas fósiles de las formas de vida, huellas fósiles más antiguas que se conocen en la vida. Se conoce desde hace más de 500 millones de años. ¿Y qué es? ¿Cómo es posible que alguien, algún organismo, algún bicho, alguna colonia, a 1000 metros de profundidad, en la oscuridad de ese mar profundo, sea capaz de hacer estos hexágonos perfectos, de mover los granitos de arena para construir esos hexágonos perfectos? Eso son tubos hexagonales pegados unos a otros que un animal construye en forma de trampa para que diferentes bacterias entren ahí dentro y después se las come. Son mecanismos de supervivencia en fondos marinos donde apenas hay recursos. Y la vida se arregla, la vida se las apaña y al final sale adelante con formas tan curiosas como estas. Este gran libro que es el Flis de nuestra costa, en el que está inspirada la obra, tiene muchísimos detalles pequeños. Incluso si lo miramos a microscopio, fijaros, si todas esas capas son páginas de ese libro extraordinario, los personajes de nuestra novela son estos. Esas capas están formadas por miles y miles y miles y miles de microfósiles que solamente podemos ver a microscopio. Se llaman foraminíferos, es igual. Eran pequeños organismos que vivían en aquel mar y que cuando morían, pues sus conchas caen al fondo del mar y quedan atrapadas en esas capas. Pero fijaros qué formas más bonitas tienen. Esos organismos, las celdas que tienen en su interior, las formas de las celdas, el tamaño de las celdas, el grosor de las paredes, todo eso depende de factores ambientales, de la salinidad, de la temperatura del agua. A través de la lectura de estos bichitos, si queréis, podemos interpretar muy bien cómo ha ido variando las condiciones ambientales a lo largo de esos casi 60 millones de años. Porque no es lo mismo encontrarse un tipo de fósiles que encontrarse otro tipo de fósiles. De manera que esas capas son mucho más que capas bonitas, son capas que tienen muchísima información en su interior. Claro, y cuando leemos un libro, sabemos muy bien que los libros empiezan de una manera y terminan de otra manera y tienen capítulos donde pasan cosas más potentes, cosas que de repente cambian la historia. Momentos en los que el libro, la novela, la historia da un vuelco. Pues en la historia de la Tierra eso también pasa y queda muy bien reflejado en lugares como este. En esta cala rojiza, en estas rocas rojizas, cuando entramos en su interior, vemos una capa de color negro, una capa que solamente tiene 2-3 milímetros, nada más, una capa de color negro, muy finita, ¿sí? Muy finita. Pero cuando miramos dentro de esa capa, vemos cosas como esta. Una esférula cristalina, una no, muchísimas, esférulas cristalinas, eso quiere decir que en algún momento eso ha estado fundido y que se ha cristalizado y que son ricas en níquel. Y además tiene mucho iridio. Esto son pequeñas gotas fundidas del meteorito que cayó hace 66 millones de años en Yucatán y que extinguió a los dinosaurios al 70% de las especies. Gracias a que estas pequeñas gotas fundidas llegaron a lugares como este, hoy en día sabemos que aquella gran extinción tuvo algo que ver con el impacto de un meteorito. En este lugar podemos hablar de la historia de la vida, podemos hablar de que en la historia de la vida ha habido grandes crisis, grandes catástrofes, grandes extinciones, pero que al mismo tiempo esas grandes extinciones han supuesto una oportunidad excelente para otras especies que han llegado después. Hoy en día los ecólogos dicen que la tasa de extinción de las especies es similar a cualquiera de las 5 grandes extinciones que existen en la historia de la Tierra. Es decir, que estamos en la 6ª gran extinción. Hay mucha bibliografía con este tema. Bueno, pues son lugares que, mirando al pasado de la Tierra, nos permiten entender ese lugar en el que estamos hoy. Lugares no tan bonitos, pero que tienen muchísima información. En estas arcillas rojas, por ejemplo, los isótopos de carbono y de oxígeno, da igual lo que son los isótopos, el carbono y el oxígeno que están metidas en esas arcillas, nos cuentan que hace 56 millones de años, solamente 10 millones de años después de la extinción de los dinosaurios, hubo una gran inyección de carbono a la atmósfera, de metano concretamente, y que la temperatura en la Tierra subió en torno a 8 grados, entre 5 y 8 grados en función de la latitud, hace 56 millones de años. Ese es uno de los mayores calentamientos climáticos que ha habido en la historia reciente de la Tierra, y fue también por efecto invernadero. Y esto lo que nos está diciendo es que el sistema climático se puede alterar mucho más del 1,5 grados que llevamos ya acumulado en las últimas décadas. Se puede alterar hasta 8 grados, eso ya ha pasado antes. Y mirando estas rocas podemos entender muy bien cuáles fueron las consecuencias de aquel supercalentamiento climático. Dicen los geólogos que este es seguramente el mejor espejo que tenemos para entender lo que puede ser el cambio climático en las siguientes décadas. La historia, en este sentido, se repite. Se repite en el ámbito climático, vamos a decir, y en el ámbito de las extinciones o de la desaparición de las especies. Si es la 6ª extinción y si provocamos un cambio climático similar al de hace 55 millones de años, no sería la primera vez que ocurre. Pero a mí esto no me vale. No me vale decir que no es la primera vez que ocurre. Sería la primera vez que ocurre de manera consciente. Y sería la primera vez que ocurre teniendo las herramientas posibles para solucionarlo. Hay algo que llama la atención de estas capas. Estas capas se formaron en posición horizontal y hoy en día están en posición vertical. Es lo que llama la atención, son capas perfectas en posición vertical. Claro, cuando aquella península ibérica se empezó a mover, chocó con el continente europeo y lo que hizo es que todos aquellos fondos marinos pues, se levantaran, se plegaran y hoy en día tengamos esas capas en posición vertical. Pero recordar que no son más que miles y miles de fondos marinos. Y eso se ve en las rocas. Las rocas se pliegan, por muy duras que parezcan, las rocas se pliegan como si fueran plastilina. Las rocas se fracturan con familias de fracturas muy bien organizadas y a veces muy bonitas. Algunas se rellenan de calcita y dan fracturas blancas, otras no. Bueno, y finalmente llega el mar. Llega el mar que empieza a erosionar y a erosionar y a erosionar. Y fijaros, se va comiendo la costa y nos va mostrando ese libro. Nos va mostrando ese gran libro que nosotros podemos caminar por la base de los acantilados, aquí, en Donosti, en Jaizkibel, en cualquier lugar. Gracias a algunos mapeos, algunas cartografías que se han hecho, sabemos que esta gran plataforma, que dejan los acantilados cuando retroceden, tiene continuidad mar adentro, algunos kilómetros, y que cuando miramos un poco con detalle esa plataforma, vemos que esa plataforma tiene una especie de escalones. Tiene una pendiente media de en torno al 1%, quizás algo que me puede corregir, pero lo importante es que tiene una especie de escalones. Esos escalones son antiguas líneas de acantilado, seguramente, de antiguos niveles de mar. Hace solamente 20.000 años, cuando nuestros antepasados pintaban Ekain, lo he dicho varias veces, pero es que es un momento cercano, el nivel del mar estaba en torno a 80, 100 metros más bajo que la actualidad. Y eso pasó también antes varias veces. Eso quiere decir que solamente en 20.000 años el nivel de mar ha recuperado su posición natural hasta 100 metros de altura, que la línea de costa estaba casi 10 kilómetros más allá. Y que de manera natural estas cosas han ido sucediendo. Y es muy bonito ver cómo la naturaleza, la vida, se ha ido adaptando a esos cambios naturales de que el mar sube y el mar baja. Cuando el mar sube, los estuarios se mueven hacia adentro. Cuando el mar baja, los estuarios se mueven hacia abajo. La vida coloniza esos estuarios y va generando estas formas que se trasladan poco a poco hacia el interior o se trasladan poco a poco hacia la costa en función de ese baile del nivel del mar. La cuestión es cómo nosotros vamos a ser capaces de adaptarnos a esa subida cuando solamente nos hemos instalado, vamos a decir, en esa línea costera hace unos pocos centenares de años. Y mientras, pues el ciclo continúa. Cada vez que llueve, a mí me gusta mucho ver cómo los ríos nos dejan estas grandes manchas de sedimento, que no es otra cosa que las montañas que se van deshaciendo poco a poco van volviendo a sus orígenes, esos granitos de arena, granitos de calizas, que poco a poco van volviendo al fondo marino, que es el lugar de donde nacieron. Y el aire, pues poco a poco, el viento poco a poco va erosionando esas areniscas, va dando este tipo de formas que tienen mucho que ver con la obra de Ondalea. Nada cambia, todo se va adaptando. La verdad, hoy me han preguntado varias veces qué es lo que nos dice una escultura como la que hemos disfrutado hoy. Yo prefiero no responder. Yo creo que a cada uno seguramente le va a decir algo diferente. Yo lo que sí diré es que yo me he fijado más en la parte, pero es de formación profesional, yo me he fijado más en la parte sólida que en la parte líquida. Dice muchas cosas. A mí, en la parte sólida, me ha parecido una factura espectacular. Me ha parecido una cosa muy, muy, muy bien hecha. Me ha llamado mucho la atención. Yo sé que esas rocas, si dan esas formas, son rocas muy blanditas. Y ver esas formas de rocas blanditas, que son las de Jaizkibel, las areniscas de Jaizkibel, verlas en un bronce, en un material potente que brilla, a mí me ha parecido una cosa, prefiero no decir más. Bueno, finalmente, para terminar, lo que ese abismo debería de ser, pues creo que es lo que la propia Cristina quiso que fuera, y así queda reflejado en un apunte suyo, que no sé cuándo es, pero dice: un lugar de encuentro, un lugar para observar y pensar, para reflexionar sobre la naturaleza y la importancia de su conservación. El abismo hacia el mar nos conectará con las profundidades y con el aquarium, con el estudio del mar y sus criaturas. Nada más, eskerrik asko.
Eskerrik asko. Qué gozada cuando la pasión se convierte en profesión y encima tienes la capacidad de divulgarlo de tal manera que estábamos, yo no sé, pero yo estaba enganchadísima. O sea, ni Juego de Tronos, os lo digo de verdad. Eskerrik asko. Bueno, let us move on to the next speaker. We have the pleasure to introduce you to Penelope Cortis. Penelope Cortis is an art historian specializing in modern sculpture. She is the author of Patio and Pavilion, The Place of Sculpture in Modern Architecture, and Vertical, Horizontal, Open, Closed Sculpture, as well as other monographs and texts for contemporary artists. She directed the Museum Calouste Gulbenkian and Tate Britain after creating the Henry Moore Institute as a center for the study of sculpture in Leeds. She is currently a visiting professor at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Her lecture is entitled Art Underground, Spaces of Renewal. A big round of applause, please.
Thank you very much. It was hard to write this I wrote it in Washington, so it was rather in a vacuum before I'd seen the piece, obviously, and I'm not talking about the site and I'm not talking about the artist. James asked me to talk about something related, whatever I wanted that seemed to be related, and I hope it is. Maybe not as much as I would like it, but I hope it speaks to you, and to you, Christina. So, the island of Santa Clara, chosen by Cristina Iglesias, places her work in the space between the sculptures of two predecessors, Chillida and Oteiza. Thank you. So this is between the wind comb and the empty construction. And now I see very clearly how really this place is between those two sculptures. And Jorge Oteiza commented in 1988 on the fact, I quote, "It seems as these two Basques had always to be close and always confronting one another, as if it were necessary for two sculptors in Basque to explain in Basque one sculptor only. But today we're going to think of a third sculptor, and we shall think in terms of roots, of foundations, and of sources, in stone and in water. Cristina Iglesias' work has increasingly been made with respect to nature and to natural forces. And to mark the inauguration of her work on Santa Clara, I propose to think about a recent lineage of sculptors working underground and about their links to the art of the prehistoric era. And in this we encounter geology and the geological underpinnings of a surprising number of artistic projects. And here is one relevant quotation on the screen, obviously translated from a letter that Paul Cézanne wrote to Joachim Gasquet at the end of the 19th century. In order to paint a landscape well, I first need to discover its geological foundations. And I think it's very interesting to see how a painter can also feel this need to understand geology better, and it's also very much part of the time of the late 19th century. The Latin has several words for stone, which we find scattered throughout our modern vocabularies: lapis, petra, saxum. And the Greek lith is also found in descriptions of stone-based technologies and forms. But curiously enough, geological terms are very much in English, reflecting the scale of activity by British geologists from the late 18th century onwards, attracted above all by the exposed fossil beds on the coastal cliffs, but also by the Industrial Revolution, which uncovered that geology, the railways and the canals being built in Britain. So thus the periodization of the world's geology, Cambrian, Devonian, etc., is strangely British in source, although certain key terms, such as the Jurassic, come from France, from Jura. And when Cézanne's childhood friend, the geologist Antoine Fortuné Marion, marked out the sedimentary layers in the artist's sketchbook, he used French and English names for each successive stage. And these layers, or couches, might be seen as applicable to geology, but also to painting. And indeed, Cézanne's red and ochre paints, the very paints themselves, came from the landscape he was painting, from the local pigments. There are three basic types of stone. So now I'm going to be very simplistic in comparison to the previous speaker. And their names give us an instant description of how they came to be made. Igneous, made in fire. Sedimentary, made in layers. And metamorphic, made through change. And the best known examples of each would be igneous granites, sedimentary sandstones, and true metamorphic marbles. And then, of course, there are many other kinds of stone, mixtures which are used inventively all around us, especially when standard building stone is lacking. and that might be flint or tufa or onyx or alabaster, pumice or lava. And tufa is used as a building material in areas where there has been volcanic activity, and much of Pompeii, for example, had already been built in tufa before it was buried in lava. Sometimes we forget that not all countries have stone for building. Some countries have much more stone than others. So despite its weight, strangely enough, stone travels around the world. It's now traveling above all from China, India, Spain, Italy, and Iran to countries which have less stone, or stone which is less cheaply available. In the medieval period, the Baltic island of Gotland became rich by serving as a quarry for monumental masonry all over the Baltic coastline, and especially in Holland, which has little or no stone of its own. And Gotland was, of course, well placed for sea transport. In England, Nottingham alabaster, in the same period, was equally widespread throughout Europe, but only because it was used for small things. The division of sandstone into three types, aeolian, fluvial, and marine, leads us again at once to the ways in which stone was formed, by wind, by river, or by sea. Stone is the result of weather, as we have been hearing, of huge elemental shifts in level and temperature, which occurred over hundreds of millions of years. And in England, Auden's poem in praise of limestone, and there's a small extract from the poem, recognizes the water-based character of limestone, as you can see. I won't read that out to you, but he talks a lot about the weathered outcrops, the hilltop temple, from appearing waters to conspicuous fountains. And I think what I'm talking about and what I found more strongly yesterday is this link between stone and water. And that's what we see in Christina's piece. Water and stone go hand in hand, and they make for special places, at least health-giving, if not spiritual, but very often both. The quarry which Cézanne painted at Bibemus was named for drinking. This is this amazing painting by Cézanne around the turn of the century in the quarry Bibemus. And the stone from this quarry was used for the Roman spa town of Aquae Sestiae, so again a link between stone and water, and a town named after the waters. When Cézanne began painting here around 1897, the quarry had just been abandoned and was gradually returning to nature. Stone is intrinsically linked to time, given that the study of rocks allowed scientists to develop a timeline which underpins our understanding of the evolution of our planet. Despite this, and although rock can be dated, stone, strangely enough, is often very hard to date, given that it can be used and reused. Thus, we fall back on aesthetics to date buildings which have a very tiny chronology in comparison to the stones with which they are made. So even if we include stone structures such as Stonehenge in England or the pyramids in Egypt, which are about 5,000 years old, we are looking at an infinitesimal section of deep time, as we just heard. And thus we put to one side the date of the building material itself and look instead at when it was put to use by builders and architects. So we can date the lighthouse of Santa Clara much more accurately than the rock on which it is built. We can look also at how the use of stone reflects human time more specifically. It is not only geography which determines our use of stone. Politics play a large part. For example, in the period of Napoleon, the blockades saw big shifts towards the use of native stones. And even more recently, the effects of 9/11 in America in 2001 and the subsequent invasion of Iraq in 2003 had big impacts on the use of stone. Regime change has visible effects on monuments. Iconoclasm has often irreparably damaged those erected to previous rulers or gods. In times of war, not only is it harder to get to foreign materials, but there is also an increasing propaganda value in using indigenous materials. Sculpture is often divided into two types, additive and subtractive. And if we use the same terms in relation to stone architecture, we can see that some sites are indeed carved out of the rock. The rock churches in Lalibela in Ethiopia are a well-known example, and so too are the carved caves and grottos of Ajanta, Ellora, Cappadocia, and indeed the Rupestrian churches of southern Italy. Here in San Sebastián, Donosti, Cristina has largely subtracted, finding her way inside and creating a new source. The use of stone to build upwards is, of course, much more common and would characterize the major ecclesiastical monuments of medieval Europe, as well as countless buildings around us. But stone was usually only used when it was either cheap and easily available, or when it was a matter of prestige. The simple stone cottages of rural communities are rarely far from a quarry. Otherwise, they would have been made in wood or plaster or brick, and they would have disappeared. There is another kind of stone construction in which the stone is neither carved nor cut. The Neolithic structures which abound in Celtic Europe, and of which Stonehenge and Karnak are perhaps the best known, but there are plenty around here, use stones as found largely, although we increasingly see that some of those stones also were worked. This provides us with an interim definition which lies between stone and rock, the piece and the source. Boulders, monoliths, menhirs, and pebbles, single stones, only needed to be moved to make them usable. And they have an interesting recent parallel in the erratic boulder, which were carried like changelings on an incoming glacier, and have been used mainly in the German-speaking world over the last century or so as simple but powerful monuments, all the better for being natural and not man-made. These are glacial erratics, sometimes so big they can be used for buildings. So in a sense, the smaller stones are, the less useful they become. Stones are not nearly as useful as stone. Although dry stone walling is a skilled activity, it was never as lucrative as that of a mason. Masons were a highly protective guild, as we understand from their marks, and from the evolution of Masonic guilds. Good stone had to be cut and dressed, and this acquired knowledge is still in daily evidence in the quarries, for example in Carrara or Estremoz. Stone is readily equated with longevity. It is not only known to be much older than humankind, but is used to fashion monuments which pretend to outlast us. Tombstones and altar stones are but the most obvious stones to embody the notion of life beyond death. Stately pleasure domes, towers, castles, walls, all are made of stone, and they pretend to last indefinitely beyond our petty ambitions. But as we know, buildings can be dismantled and their cut stones used elsewhere, and thus the shift from sacred to secular is often made visible in this way. A lapidarium is a collection of stones, many with inscriptions carved into their surfaces, commemorating people and events. We talk of a lapidary prose, evoking this sense of permanence in relation to succinct and elegant phrases which are appropriate to their purpose. Stone and writing are quite closely intertwined, stones being suitable for the engraving of inscriptions. Although the historic monuments which have lasted longest are indeed made of stone, stone is less solid than it might appear. Many stones are soft and corrode easily. Plaster casts of historic monuments may in fact tell us more now about those original surfaces. It is odd, I think, that plaster, a substance made of ground-up stone, can outlive solid stone. Even if we think of stone as stable, perhaps even in a biblical sense, in terms of the rock of refuge, that's Psalm 71, or the Rock of Ages, and remembering that Peter is the rock upon which the church is built. Isaiah 26 strikes a cautionary note. Here the Lord is described as a rock of ages who can level the lofty city, bringing it down to dust. We should remember, in fact, how often stone turns to dust, not least in the form of concrete, which is an amalgam of ground stone, and Portland cement, which is itself a mixture of limestone, clay, and gypsum. Indeed, more stone goes into the construction industry in the form of aggregate than it does in solid. And more stone nowadays is ground down even further into concrete, plaster, talc, or dust. And recently, when the Suez Canal was blocked, it was interesting to discover that the goods which were largely blocking that canal were containers of sand. It's sand that is being moved around the world. So in this way, stone has helped engender the cast, which goes to make the bronze, the simulacrum, which we now see on the island of Santa Clara, a space that allows us to imagine ourselves inside the stone, a special privilege. So that's my beginner's account of geology. Now I'll move into something that I know, or am maybe slightly more qualified to talk about, which is art. So here we go into the tunnel or the cave. So on September the 11th, 1940, Henry Moore was returning from a night out at the theatre with his wife when they were caught by one of the first air raids and obliged to spend time on the platform of the Underground where they happened to be. So this is the beginning of the Blitz in London, the first week of the air raids on London. And this episode, in which Henry Moore was forced to spend time on the platform, was to lead to Moore's making hundreds of underground drawings. And those drawings brought Henry Moore to a much wider public, and in a way that was both topical and timeless. And perhaps that's what we're talking about today, the topical and deep time. And strangely enough, by coincidence, the very next day, September the 12th, 1940, a young Frenchman walking his dog in the Dordogne saw how the ground had opened up after the fall of a tree, and returning with 3 friends, he discovered the cave paintings of Lasso. And they were announced in the press, both in France and abroad, by the end of the month. But it was only in November 1940 that the paintings were deemed to be authentic. However, they were kept largely closed and only ever opened to the public for a period of 15 years, when the photographs of the caves taken by Frederick Vandels were finally published in 1949. They caught the artistic imagination. So this was something that was announced but invisible. It was underground. But the strange coincidence of these two events, these two unrelated events, is something I want to make more of here, for I think they have something in common. Moore's experience was a new one. The London Blitz had only just begun. So what was to become a familiar experience for many over the next months and years was, at that time, unfamiliar. And similarly, the discovery of the caves was charged with new meaning at that time, because only 3 months earlier, the Nazi army had taken Paris. But Lasso was in the free zone in France, so these caves were used by the resistance. They were used to store their weapons, and they were only open to the public in 1948. So these two events acquired new meaning because of the war, and shelter became important. It's part and parcel of their meaning. These underground settings were hidden from the enemy, they were places of safety, and they were also places of art. And that may be obvious, but I think that we can think about this in a deeper way, and this association is my link. Moore went on from the so-called shelter drawings to being officially commissioned for another underground subject, the coal mines of his home in Yorkshire. And those drawings were also incorporated into exhibitions which travelled around Britain and also went to America, to MoMA. So they became a key part of the war story in Britain. And these drawings achieved respect long before Moore's sculpture, and they were held in great affection very quickly. And that's especially true of the drawings which became known as the sleepers, the people who were sheltering from the war in the underground in London. They have a great mystery, and they have a great reach beyond the local. In 1944, Henry Moore made illustrations for a play which was an adaptation of the Odyssey, written by an English author, Edward Sackville West. It was a radio play called The Rescue. And here Henry Moore is drawing the sleeping Odysseus, placed by his sailors with his treasure in front of the Naiads' cave. And this cave has two entrances opposite each other, one for mortals and one for immortals. And you see that Odysseus is lying on one side. And Moore's extraordinary drawings show the sleeping hero on the cave floor. The sea is sometimes visible, sometimes not, and it's both a point of arrival and of departure. And the nymphs, to whom the site is a natural landmark and who own that site, they enable Odysseus to return home. And their cave is depicted as a tunnel, almost a circular wall, with Odysseus, the shipwrecked sailor, at its eye. But that tunnel represents shelter. It's a safe place. The underground space, I think, took on a new and real significance during the war. It was used as a shelter, as a hiding place, and its protective curves provided a physical buffer from attack. But it also came to life as a place of vision, and this combination of the physical support with its overlay of imaginary beings, masses and images comes into focus. It's a kind of screen, but a screen which wraps solidly over its viewers. The walls of the cave or the tunnel are home to linear and living drawings. The Caves of Lasso, to go back to Lasso, there's Odysseus and some of the poetry. Henry Moore made many drawings on this topic. He became very interested by this idea. So the Caves of Lasso were first examined by the Abbé Breuil, who's also known in the north of Spain. He was among the first group to visit them just a fortnight after their discovery. And Breuil had already drawn the caves in Altamira, and he was at that time really the expert. He traveled all over the north of Spain and southern France over the previous 50 years. And of the many wartime explorations made in France, Lasso was certainly the most impressive. In attempting to describe the sequence of spaces, contemporary authors, unsurprisingly, frequently make recourse to an ecclesiastical vocabulary. They describe these chambers in terms of the nave, the sanctuary, the apse, and even they talk about the whole as the Sistine Chapel. And it seems so natural for them to talk about Paleolithic sites in Christian terms that we might almost forget that that's strange. And that vocabulary comes into sharper focus when we begin to look at some of the monuments which were being built just after the discovery of Lasso, just at the end of World War II. So I want to begin there with a really remarkable monument in Rome. This is called the Fosse Ardartine, and it's a monument on the Via Ardartina. It was announced before the war ended and just after the Nazi reprisal killings. It opened in 1949, and this was a conflation, really, of an underground space with death and commemoration. But this is a place that was already had its own terrible history, because over 300 Italian prisoners had been taken to these quarries and shot there by the Nazis, and then hidden, and they exploded the caves so as to hide the bodies. So this was a cold-blooded, calculated massacre. The fosse had been chosen as a place of secrecy, But after Rome was liberated, only 10 weeks later, the bodies were found and buried. So this was a place that the new Italian Republic was very keen to make into a special memorial, and they did. They had a competition, they had 12 groups of competitors, and in the end they chose 2 groups who were merged together. And the form of the monument echoes the vocabulary applied to the Lasso caves. I think you can see some of the similarity in the map. And they talk a lot about the same kind of spaces, the chapel, the sanctuary, the tunnel. And the sacrarium itself is overlaid by a massive suspended concrete slab, which was made of reinforced concrete. So this was often talked about not so much as an object and not so much as a sculpture or as a monument, but as a passage. So I think, again, that's something interesting about moving around and through a place, a special place that has been created to make us think in a new way. And this was described by the American critic Lewis Mumford in the following terms: the brown volcanic stone wall made of great flat field stones, rising gradually in height, the gate, the paved area, the cave, the long high passage, the humble chapel, the dark passage, the sunken burial ground. And he described this oppressive monotony as relieved only by the contrast in texture of the wall, the rough concrete ceiling, and the pitted granite surface of the graves. So again, as with here, I think there's a link because it's made from the local materials. It's made from what is on the site. It's a combination of contemporary and antique. And a lot of the techniques were ancient Roman, but then they also used the reinforced concrete to give it a homogeneous quality. It linked also with the catacombs nearby and the Via Appia with its heavy stones and the opus incertum of the walls around the area. So it's the walls which speak. And this was probably the first and maybe still the most impressive post-war monument, but there are a couple of others I just want to touch on. And one was a project which never happened, but again, I think it has interesting links. This was a project for the southwest tip of Portugal, and it was part of the ongoing and ultimately unrealized project to Henry the Navigator. On the western tip of Sagres, where he sent the fleet, this competition was the third. It was launched in 1954. It was rapidly abandoned because, of course, Salazar was increasingly threatened by United Nations sanctions against the Portuguese Empire. But this was a huge project in which they would have burrowed underground on the rock and built this huge underground chamber. And so there was both an upper level, which was a concrete sail or to represent the boat, and then the underground sacrarium. So this combination of what you see above being different from what you find underneath, I think is very interesting, that there is a surprise waiting for you underground. And again, I think that here the architecture is much more impressive than the actual sculpture, which was a figurative figure by a relatively unknown artist, whereas the thinking of how to use the space and the site really was the sculptural quality. And again, they talk about the same they use the same terms. They talk about the grottos of Altamira, they talk about the caves of the Louvre, and they talk about the crypt of Assisi. So this, again, they're looking to the prehistoric and to the Christian in terms of thinking about the underground space. And the third monument, which I think is interesting to think about here, is a rather incredible monument in Paris, which is the memorial to the Martyrs de la Déportation, the people who were deported. And this site was chosen in 1954, but it took a while to build. But it's an interesting site because, again, it's surrounded by water. It's on the island in the Seine. So you don't immediately see it. You have to go down this narrow corridor and down some very steep steps through this narrow corridor, and you arrive in this place where you are effectively captured by the architecture around you, which is by an architect called Pingusson. It finally opened properly in 1962. It was only announced publicly in 1955. And again, this is a very fixed parcours. So a little bit as with the island, you have a point of arrival, a particular journey that you make to get to the opening, and then you go down the steps, then you go in. There's only one way round you can go. And it's a garden and a crypt. And I think the materials are also interesting here because he chose to make the concrete from all the different mountains in France. So it was an effort to really represent the material geology of the country. But in this case, because it was a monument, it also mixed the ashes and the earth of each of the deportation camps. So it has that extra layer of horror, you might say, in its material mix. And this monument is made in situ, and the concrete was mixed here. And it's a combination of an ordinary concrete behind and a finer white concrete at front. So Pingusson said in an early note about the monument, I'll read it in French, les matières premières utilisées comme agrégats seraient des galets silicieux ou granitiques, des têtes de calcaire dures, des marbres, de façon de constituer une sorte de granit géant. Le lion serait un super ciment blanc. So this was he called this a monument in stone in itself. So the material was very important. It was then bush-hammered, éclaté au pic on the outside and éclaté au bouchard on the inside. So this sense of a hand tooling of a man-made material with a continuous surface. And Pingusson was an interesting architect because later on when he worked on a town, a dilapidated city or village in France called Griand, he again mixed all the local stones to make what he called a natural architecture. So I'm going to move on from these three post-war memorials, which I think were recognized at the time to be unusually successful, but also have set a kind of model which we've seen more recently in many of the monuments of the end of the 20th century, especially the Holocaust memorials, to create a very spectacular and highly managed spatial experience. So I'm going to go back now to Lasso. And these are some of the photographs which were finally published in 1949, 9 years after the discovery of Lasso. And they were photographed by Fernand Vandels. And as you can see, they were really spectacular and strangely artistic photographs. They don't seem documentary, they seem more like an artistic experience. But he noted in his introduction that they were untouched photographic plates. So he was claiming that documentary realism. And these images were accompanied by a number of texts. And most of those people who were in that first group who discovered these caves went on to write their own books. One of the people who was most inspired by Lasso early on was the architectural historian Siegfried Giedion, who was also the husband of Carola Giedion-Welke, who's really important in the history of modern sculpture. I always think that she's underplayed in relation to him. And Giedion visited Lasso in 1949, and then he was a founding member of the International Committee for Prehistoric Art, which was set up in the very early 1950s. And Giedion is well known for his work on modern architecture, but at this point, as many people after World War II, he was going backwards in time, and he wrote this book called The Eternal Present. After, in fact, he'd been in Washington and giving the Mellon lectures about new discoveries in prehistoric art. And he divided it into two, the beginnings of art in terms of art and the beginnings of architecture. And in fact, he realized that he was much more drawn to the beginnings of art because he understood at the end of working on this that the beginnings of art are not architectural, they are art. He found them in the caves of Altamira and of Lasso. And he was very interested in the darkness of these places and the fact that the role of visibility was downplayed, and what became much more important was touch and also sound. And he understood that by going round the caves and listening to the caves, he had to deploy new senses. So the visibility became less important, and what you could hear and touch became much more important. The person who gave the Mellon lectures before Gideon was Herbert Reed, a famous sculptor and painting historian of the period and great, he had a finger in every pie in modern art at the time in Europe and America. And he had already talked about the Venus figurines found in these places as the origins of sculpture. But Gideon felt that Reed was wrong and that really the beginnings of art are in sculpture and they are two-dimensional. They're the relief, they're on the wall. He also was determined to see an order in prehistoric art, whereas many writers have talked about it as being chaotic or disordered. Gideon talked about the opposite, the order of the prehistoric. And Gideon is very much part of a big popularization of the prehistoric, which in Britain, which is what I can talk about most familiarly, was also familiarized by this woman, Jacquetta Hawkes, who was herself an archaeologist and also the wife of an archaeologist. And there was a big promotion to make what was being discovered in the archaeology of the time more available to the general public. And I think that links with what is happening in this conference today. I'm kind of trying to push a specialist understanding of geology and conservation issues into a broader field. And I think every generation or two there is a wish to try and make that happen. And Jacquetta Hawkes was actually responsible for one of the storylines of the Festival of Britain, a big post-war festival in London in 1951 and elsewhere. And this book was part of that effort, really, to talk about the land in a more understandable way. This book was also illustrated by Henry Moore, as it happened. And she worked with the architect Basil Spence in Glasgow to make one of the festival halls. This was the Hall of Power, and it was a huge carved wall of coal. Again, an underground space which you went in, so it has this kind of mixture of the ecclesiastical, almost kind of celestial entrance and a kind of dark underground space. So I think, again, this is something that links the ancient and the modern, and the symbolic and the real. And I think this whole interest, of course, in the Paleolithic and Neolithic cultures is very present here. And you know more than I do about Jorge Oteiza, but I know that he had come back to Bilbao in 1948. He had been in South America for a decade. He studied megalithic culture in Colombia. He'd actually written lectures on it, which he'd given in Lima. And he published those essays, you probably know them, in Madrid in 1952. So he was part of that new discovery of the local culture in this area and local validation of that period. And I think that his interest, it's interesting to me that Oteiza is talking on the one hand about all sculpture is the funerary stele, the stella funeraria. But he's also thinking about how to open up sculpture. So on the one hand, he's focused on the monolith, and on the other hand, he's focusing on opening up sculpture and finding a way to include hollowness and emptiness. And how those two poles of sculpture, the monolithic and the spatial, the emptiness, something that sculptors have wrestled with, but I think we see a kind of solution here in terms of the solid and the empty. I would have loved to have gone to see the monument to Padre Donosti in Lesaca. Is that how you say Lesaca? Eginia? Because I think there you understand that relationship with the Cromlichs in this area. And he was following Gideon because in 1965 he asked the Paris Institute for Prehistoric Research for help in setting up a fund to preserve Basque culture, this Neolithic culture. And I think that combination of the roots of Basque culture with a rethinking of modern sculpture is absolutely emblematic, not just of this area, but of modern sculpture in general. It's absolutely central to rethinking modern sculpture in the last 3 generations, let's say. And I just have a couple of pictures here of, I think, just a key event. This was a project that only became visible properly in 1960, but was made by the artist Frederick Kiesler, and he'd been working on it for the previous 12 years or so, The Endless House, which is an interesting combination of kind of interior, exterior, but also underground, overground. And it was shown in 1960 in the famous exhibition by Arthur Drexler at MoMA in New York, in a special room of its own. It's only a model with photographs, but you had a very good sense of how that strange, curvaceous, textured object might have been if it had been realized. And Kiesler thought that when the museum bought the maquette in 1950, they were going to make the house. They never did. So this was the nearest it got. But if you see the plans that Kiesler made for the Endless House, you have a sense again of that kind of cave-like quality and the continuous wall and a kind of a dreamlike, oniric, destabilizing sense of where am I, what is solid, what is not solid, what is up, what is down. And I think that Kiesler is also relevant in thinking about famous project by Paul Virilio. And again, this has a very long chronology because Paul Virilio could not go to the coast during the war because the coast where he was born on the Loire was forbidden because it was taken over by the army. So he grew up without being able to go to the coast. So you can imagine how hard that was. When he finally was able to visit the beaches of Normandy and the Loire coast, in the beginning he didn't really take account of these objects, these structures, and only later, in 1958, he began to realize how fascinating they were, and then he began taking photographs, and that emerged as his famous project about the Atlantic Wall. It wasn't until 1975 when these photographs were finally shown in Paris and then published by the Pompidou Center that it became famous. And it was only translated into English 20 years later. So Paul Virilio's legacy has been very slow, I think, and very delayed. But that consciousness he has and has brought to us of this amazing structure, which is half marine, half land, and inside and outside, this smooth surface which was originally all about not being taken. So the smoother a surface was, the harder it is to take. So it's all about defensive architecture, military architecture, but it's also about nature. And it's about curves. And I think that it's a very complicated text and I think impossible to analyze. But it's partly archaeological and it's partly psychological, but it's also about nature. And there's a very, I think, interesting positioning of these objects in time, because he talks about the fact that the form, they anticipate their own erosion in geological terms, because they suppress all superfluous forms. The bunker is prematurely worn and smoothed to avoid all impact. So it's an object that is already old, in a sense, and therefore defies time to a degree. And thinking about these as objects that you can go into and are on the coast. I think, again, it seems to me relevant in a way. My last contemporary example, or more or less contemporary, is to think about Tony Smith. Here we are in Glenstone, by the way. And thinking about Tony Smith's late sculptures, because he became increasingly interested in how we could actually enter a sculpture, whereas his earlier pieces were much more closed. And Smith is often thought about as a mathematician, but I think he's also a kind of magician. And he made this really interesting project in Osaka for the World Fair. Not very good photographs survive of it, but it's on the right. This was called the Bat's Cave. You see on the left the little paper models that he made, and then all these different tetrahedrons were put together to make a cave into which you could enter. And I think that thinking about that idea of entering into that space and the darkness and the supernatural quality, the fact that you can't quite define how you feel, there's something that is beyond logic, makes us think about Tony Smith in a different way. And he talked about his own inspiration for this cave in terms of Courbet, interestingly enough. This was Courbet's Source de la Lue, which is in the Jura, which was an area that was absolutely central to the creation of modern geology, in thinking about how to create that timeline. This is the Limestone Grotto, and Courbet painted this 4 times at least that we know of, and it was a geological fascination that Courbet had that foreshadows Cézanne. And interestingly enough, Courbet had a relationship with another famous geologist, Jules Marcoux, and Jules Marcoux actually commissioned Courbet to paint the roche pourrie, or the rotten rock, which is now in Dole. And I think that if you know that famous painting of Courbet's Origins of the World, you might think about this cave in relation to the female body, the geological source, and then the cave of the contemporary artist. There's something here which I think is pertinent, and these facts are linked. And in fact, if you go back into more historic art, I think you find this very clearly. So I'm just finishing with these last 2 images. This is an image of Ariadne, so a famous classical sculpture, but placed in a grotto in England, in Stour Head, with a poem which is carved on the floor, which was actually a poem translated by the English poet Alexander Pope from a Latin verse. I can't remember if I have an image or not here. Yes, here we are. Nymph of the grot, these sacred springs I keep, and to the murmur of these waters sleep. Spare my slumbers, gently tread the cave, and drink in silence, or in silence leave. And so I'm thinking about the grotto, the cave, the female body that is the guardian of that cave, and that question of renewal and sleep and inspiration. And my final image, I think, is a picture that I got to know in Washington just recently, which is by Lucas Cranach. And this is called Nymph of the Spring. And I think apart from the woman in the foreground, you should really be looking at the spring behind her, the cave, and this entrance to the cave, the kind of vulva-like figure with the water coming forward. And this was painted in the late 1540s. It has a similar inscription in the top left corner, probably derived from the same antique verse. So, fontis nympha sacre sum num ne rompe quiesco. So, I am the nymph of the sacred spring. Do not disturb my sleep. I am resting. And although the authenticity of that poem is disputed, what we see for sure is a spring bursting forth from the rock and the reclining woman who is somehow between sleep and wakefulness. And I think that despite or even because of the erotic nature of the image, I feel emboldened to evoke the powerful and deep-rooted combination of woman, rock, and water on the island of Santa Clara in a work by Cristina Iglesias. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cortés. Thank you for your invaluable contribution. We are back after the break, so let's continue with the program welcoming. Via online, let me introduce you to Lisa Lefebvre. She's a curator, writer, editor, and public speaker. She's also inaugural executive director of Holt Smithson Foundation, an artist-endowed foundation dedicated to the creative legacies of the artists Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson. Between 2010 and 2017, Lefebvre was head of sculpture studies at the Henry Moore Institute, a part of the Henry Moore Foundation, directing the research component of the largest artist-endowed foundation in Europe. She led a program of education, research, publications, and exhibitions. Her curated exhibitions include Jiro Takamachu, The Temperature of Sculpture, The Body Extended, Sculpture and Prosthetics, Gigo, Line as Object, Katrina Palmer, the Necropolitan Line, and the Event Sculpture, as well as editing the Institute's journal essays on sculpture. Previously, Lefebvre co-curated the quinquennial exhibition British Art Show 7. The title of her paper is Island Imaginations. I yield the floor to you, Mrs. Lefebvre.
Welcome, and my thanks are many to Dr. Curtis and Dr. Hilario for two fantastic papers. My thanks are many also to James Lingwood with this very delicious invitation to think laterally and around an artist, Cristina Iglesias, whose work I deeply admire. I'm full of regret that I'm not with you, but with our pandemic times, travel from the United States to Europe is pretty much impossible. And one other detail I wanted to say, Penelope Curtis mentioned about the charismatic fish. I have, to my left-hand side, some charismatic birds. For me, it's early in the morning, and it is the perfect hour when youthful birds start screaming to their parents to have their breakfast. So you'll hear sounds of New Mexico, where I am, across the audio here with you. So my plan is to think through over the next 35 minutes or so how islands have become sites for the imagination. Once you start thinking about it, imagined elsewheres become filled with islands. There is so much to say about islands. Islands are sites of exile and sites of escape, sites of utopia and dystopia, sites of fear and desire, strategic locations to take possession of, places to escape to and from. Islands are sites for projection of remote pasts and slippery futures. Islands are the places that feel the changes of the world first. Today, Cristina Iglesias is our focus. And for island studies, she is an artist who engages with these projections using great erudition. And what fascinates me so much about her work, or your work, Cristina, is that you invite us to think with you on islands as productive microcosms. So as I talk, I'm planning to share with you 5 references, but perhaps only 4 if I talk a little too much. 1, the 4th, is Cristina's Estancias Sumergidas. My references have been chosen, excuse me, just a little, here we are. My references have been chosen by thinking through Cristina's projects. And these references are island punctuation points that expand on the ideas that I want to share and test with you. Let me start with the first. This is a book that has such a rich discussion of the edge of the sea. Written in 1955 In this book, Rachel Carson studies the coast of Maine in the United States, a site peppered with islands. She opens her book by saying, "The edge of the sea is a strange and beautiful place. All through the long history of Earth, it has been an area of unrest where waves have broken heavily against the land, where the tides have pressed forward over continents, receded, and then returned. For no 2 successive days is the shoreline precisely the same. Not only do the tides advance and retreat in their eternal rhythms, but the level of the sea itself is never at rest. It rises or falls as the glaciers melt or grow, as the floor of the deep ocean basins shifts under its increasing load of sediments, or as the Earth's crust along the continental margins warps up or down in adjustment to strain and tension. Today, a little more land may belong to the sea. Tomorrow, a little less. Always the edge of the sea remains an elusive and indefinable boundary. Always the edge of the sea remains an elusive and indefinable boundary. I wonder if this is part of the reasons why islands are so fascinating to artists and writers. My following 2 references are of islands being built: Robert Smithson's Mangrove Ring and Spiral Jetty. And in the case of the latter reference, I'm going to show footage that has in fact never been seen before. So, an island. An island is both in the world and it can be the world. Islands reveal mainland truths. They are small continents that hold the world in themselves. Making an island from mangroves is the creation of a place that changes all relationships around it. The sea, the water, becomes the site. In May 1971, Robert Smithson traveled to the southern coast of Florida for 3 weeks. His plan was to make a forking island and an island maze off one of the Florida Keys. Now, these projects were never realized, but he did make this work, Mangrove Ring, from living plants and sediment, which he imagined would expand over 3 years into an island ring. In tidal areas, mangrove roots that we'll see later in my presentation in Christina's work, mangrove roots trap soil that can build up into islands. In a 1971 interview, Smithson described his interest in working with land and water. And he notes how, in this work, on Summerland Key, near Key West, I found a shallow lagoon where I built 2 5 feet wide islands and planted a 100 feet wide ring of mangrove seedlings. Mangrove seedlings, Smithson tells us, are supposed to take root almost immediately. They are called island makers because they catch sediment in their spidery roots. So island makers, how are islands made? To repeat repeat Rachel Carson, islands are special places whose edges are never at rest. Islands are bounded by their edges. Their limits constantly shift as the tides rise and fall with the warming of the seas and the drying of the rainfall. This constant change makes them time-bound territories. They are born from volcanic eruptions, from tectonic forces, from breaking land masses, from gatherings of material. They can be formed by, as Smithson would say, primordial ooze. Exposed to the elemental forces, islands are the ones that will disappear first through global warming. They are locations that embody the long history of geology. Islands can appear and disappear suddenly. They have long and short histories. They have formed and eroded topographically by the wind and by the tides above sea, and, as with icebergs, below the water, there is so much to know about islands, as Professor Ilario discussed earlier today. Islands are additive and subtractive. There are some youthful islands in our seas, less than 50 years old. The new islands of plastic are formed by accumulations. There are 5 rubbish or garbage islands that have been identified, but they're not included on maps. The impact of humanity on the Earth has ushered in a new geological era, one defined in 2016 as the Anthropocene by the International Geological Congress. And islands, we must remember, feel the changes to the surface of the planet first. Now, this term Anthropocene, it might seem to be all over the place right now, almost a tired term, but it is because it is a new word for a new time. The Anthropocene, this geological era, requires new language as well as new actions. The thinker Timothy Clark warns that, and I quote here, old words such as spring, wilderness, nature, old words such as spring, wilderness, wildlife, nature, the ocean, none of these now have the same literal reference as 100 years ago. And their cultural resonance must be conceded as having dramatically changed. So what about the language of islands? Can we still use that term usefully? I think yes. And I think we can consider, in fact, I think we must consider islands for their power and consider their past and future, taking island narratives to the surrounding continents. The literary critic Elizabeth de Lowry notes that engaging with the Anthropocene means that we must simultaneously consider the deep geological time of the planet in comparison with previous epochs as the futurity of the human species. The Anthropocene is both forward-looking and future retrospective, characterized by anticipatory logics and anticipatory mourning. We need to think with a time travel mindset to consider islands. So Spiral Jetty, this work by Robert Smithson that I'm showing right now, is an island spiral. And as a note, the first 2 film extracts that we've been looking at were shot by Nancy Holt. And this third rather goofy document was filmed by Richard Serra. I am tempted to stop this clip early, but I won't. And you'll see why I might be tempted to stop it early. The figures we can see here are Robert Smithson and Virginia Dwan. Here's the goofy part. And Nancy Holt that we saw at the beginning running around the spiral. Built at the mouth of a terminal basin rich in minerals, Spiral Jetty is a testament to Smithson's interest, fascination, investigation with entropy. Its precarious location lends itself to the structure's inevitable disintegration, and its size and its very deliberate shape seeks to almost command or change the surrounding landscape. In 1972, Smithson wrote in the catalogue for Documenta 5, nature does not proceed in a straight line. It is rather a sprawling document. Nature is never finished. Islands are never finished. And the same applies to other land masses, but the scale and reachable edges of islands makes this unfinished nature so much clearer. Constructed from 6,650 tons of rock and earth gathered from the shore, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty works as an island. It is a site. It is visited. It is a place imagined. It is a place that is documented. It exists as much in rumor and potential journey as it does in material form. And I think this sense of the rumor, the expectations of islands, of works such as Spiral Jetty, such as Estancias Sumergidas, and also as the work we're thinking about today, all of that builds up the perception of the work. So it feels disappointing to me that I'm not with you visiting Santa Clara Island, but perhaps that's really part of the work, this projection, this possibility, this potential expectation. And what is it that we expect when we see and visit islands? Often our expectations exceed the facts of an island. But once we enter island time, somehow it seems to make sense. So arrival on an island always involves this negotiation of the facts, the expectation, and the journey. Islands are dispersed through imaginations. They may well be sites for the imagination, but we must remember that they are tangible sites, places where people live, and places with distinct local histories. They are, of course, places in themselves, with map coordinates, inhabitants, and distinct biographies. We know global warming is a political crisis. We need to accept that it's not a doomed fate. We need to see if there might be some kind of route through which we can work with the situation to create a better future. This is what Smithson did, and I believe this is what Christina is doing also. Ecology is concerned with the total relations of humans to nature. Interconnectedness is integral, and ecologies provide multiple perspectives of looking at things. Human relations are built on power, and the root of many power relations is colonialism. This is a system which seeks to structure peoples, territories, and nature. Islands, again, feel this first. So humankind is a species. We are a species that can both enact and act with geological forces. Robert Smithson wrestled with the ecological discourse of his time. And at his time, he was concerned that it was positioned at arriving from a need for deliverance instead of working with the damage and finding a future solution that worked with the planet, not against it. He wanted to know where the darkness is. Smithson saw islands as material maps, and their matter was of great interest to him. He notes, the strata of the earth is a jumbled museum. Embedded in the sediment is a text that contains limits and boundaries which evade the rational order, and social structures which confine art. In order to read the rocks, we must become conscious of geological time and the layers of prehistoric time that is entombed in the Earth's crust. Islands are defined by their edges, indefinable as they are, and by their perceived and charted physical limits. As an edge territory, they are defined by themselves and by the places people have departed from to arrive on their shores. The isolation of islands can often make them encyclopedias. Some islands are inhabited by humans, others by non-human species, such as the Guano Islands that have fertilized every mainland botanical garden. Smithson was most interested in the edges, in, as he said, the backwaters and fringe areas, and in places that are free of scenic meaning. So his interest was in the peripheries and how the center requires these edges to exist. Islands always seem to be on the margins and are always in some way considered scenic. Island boundaries promise the experience of limits, and with the threshold comes knowledge that there is something beyond. Islands, I like to think, are transcendent. They go beyond the limits of the range and are independent entities. This is one of the reasons why there is often another power trying to possess them. There are so many ways that an island can be an island, and it always concerns limits. So Smithson often turned his attention to limits. When something is framed or set within limits, the possibility to exceed is created. Borders are made by time, by geography, by humans, by habits. Islands are transactional spaces, whether tangible or conceptual. Islands take on agency as they have impacts on the world. The philosopher Thomas Nail says, human social movement both shapes and is shaped by changes in climate and geology. Together, they comprise an interactional system. Geology and humans work together, consciously and unconsciously. Islands really are always elsewhere, and this has long fascinated artists and writers. As I've been thinking about islands in preparing this talk, I keep on coming across a push and pull, across pairings, across opposites. Islands seem to often be one and another, curious places that are simultaneously two things. They are both and, rather than either or. They are here and elsewhere, a place to escape to and a place to escape from, a haven and a hell, a place to be sent to as punishment and a place to be free. Islanders are particular, and I should probably give some full disclosure here. I am an islander from a small island. Islanders have the ability to lure unsuspecting mainlanders to their rocky shores. At one time, this was to disperse their ships of goods. Islanders can talk in their own language to keep outsiders out. Islands can resist. They are metaphorical, allegorical, hypothetical, and bound up with histories of capitalism and colonialism. Islands are viewing stations and objects to be viewed. They also live and breathe. When one lives on an island, there is usually much talk of the mainland, which, from an island perspective, then becomes an elsewhere. When we're thinking of islands, relativity comes to the fore. And with this comes scale, which is very different from size. Discussing islands in 1969, Robert Smithson emphasizes that scale is not bigness, rather, it is how your consciousness focuses. This island might appear big, but actually it is tiny. One particle might be seen as a gigantic tumulus. You can look at a grain of sand as a gigantic boulder. It's just how you want to look at it in terms of your scale sense. Or in 1970, writing on Spiral Jetty, he said, size determines an object, but scale determines art. A crack in the wall, if viewed in terms of scale, not size, could be called the Grand Canyon. A room could be made to take on the immensity of the solar system. Scale depends on one's capacity to be conscious of the actualities of perception. When one refuses to release scale from size, one is left with an object or language that appears to be certain. For me, this is Smithson speaking, scale operates by uncertainty. So uncertainty, islands, scale, edges. In a way, islands are punctuation to the continents. They are the commas, the full steps, the full stops, the em dashes, the places where we can take a breath, the marks on a map that are often overlooked, but like the copy editor editing a text, the cartographer knows without punctuation, a map is incomplete. An unruly island, like an unruly comma, can radically shift meaning. Islands and punctuation mark transitions and thresholds between cultural, political, and geological territories. Islands, of course, come in many sizes, but we define them as being something smaller than where we are looking at them from. Santa Clara is small to San Sebastián. Great Britain is small to Europe. Our planet is a small island on the sea of the universe. This island scale sense is crucial to the lore of an island. And most often, as I said previously, islands are described in relation to the mainland, making islands minor lands. As a minor to the mainland, an island is in a push and pull between poles, and at any time it can fluctuate from the status of being minor to being major. Islands are often dismissed for their island mentalities, a phrase that is often used to fix them as provincial and insular. Islands are often seen to be of the past, slower than the mainland, stuck in time, outdated, minor to the main, regressive rather than progressive, a place to live on the outside of society. When literature is written by island inhabitants, for example, I'm thinking particularly in relation to Christina's work and in relation to the mangrove islands that I showed earlier, I'm thinking of Marissa Conde's Mangrove Island Stories. She's an island, or was an island inhabitant. And when she writes about islands, they become something lived and experienced, released from being some kind of inhabited island science fiction, with the island stripped of being an exotic elsewhere. Marissa Conde writes of exile from islands, of the need to leave islands, and the problems of returning. Now, an island will always be insular and isolated because its boundaries are close. An island is negotiated in the round from every angle. An island's circumference is its circuit, a distance around something, a space created from a radiating center, a boundary, a limit, a perimeter. It is this that gives islands their power. So if an island is a minor land, it is an exceptional land outside of mainstream, outside of mainland thinking, and in some ways unencumbered by mainland societal expectations. I want to, with some trepidation, propose an analogy here to literature. Islands abound in literature, and it is here that they become elsewhere. And they are compelling. I would challenge everyone in this room to look at your bookshelves, and there will be island literature everywhere. On mine, I could find this week H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, Shakespeare's The Tempest, Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, J.G. Ballard's The Crystal Land. Some of these books are hard to read in our times. In fact, maybe they all are. So riven are they with language and descriptions that are built on colonial inequity. Again and again, islands within European literature are depicted as places of others, places on the outside. So on the one hand, such literature serves to reinforce stereotypes of islands being marginal, minor, powerless, voiceless. The island thinkers Rod Edmond and Vanessa Smith point out in their important book for island studies, Islands in History and Representation, that stories about islands tend to slip the net of post-colonial theorizing. In part, this is due to their marginality in terms of geopolitics and academic representation. Within the struggles of geographical power, islands are strategic places to take. Many have been claimed as territories, as dependencies, given as gifts in diplomatic negotiations, made as sovereign land extensions, becoming cultural buffer zones or entry points for economic expansion. Islands have often been seen as natural colonies or settings for ideal communities, and they're often dumping grounds for the unwanted. So they become thresholds in between spaces that, from the perspective of the mainland, are neither one thing nor another. They are fluid, as open to changes as are their edges. So here is my leap. If islands are minor to the mainland, can they be thought of in the ways that the philosophers Deleuze and Guattari think about minor literature? Okay, so what is minor literature? Well, it's not a literature written in a minor language. It is rather writing which a minority constructs within a major language. This is hard. Island voices are quieter than their continental and country cousins. Rather than a literature of a small nation, minor literature is a form of expression, a subversion of language from minority use. I'm thinking here of Edouard Glissant's writings on islands. He firmly believed that islands were the future. He suggested in 1997 that the entire world is becoming an archipelago, and Glissant celebrated the potential of the geopolitical map becoming a network of islands that celebrate their uniqueness, celebrate their codependence, as opposed to brash continental power that skirts over details. In the archipelago world, all islands have an identity and are in a liminal, in-between location, a place to move from and to, with no center to form a mainland. So it's very easy to talk about islands in general, yet each one is so specific. Their locked inhabitants have a different take, one that we can learn from. Glissant says, with continental thinking, the mind runs with audacity, but we then believe that we see the world as a block, or at large, or at once, as a kind of imposing synthesis, just as we can, by way of general aerial views, see the configurations of landscapes and mountainous areas as they pass by. With archipelago thinking, we get to know the rocks in the rivers, assuredly the smallest rocks and rivers. Archipelago thinking allows us to think through plurality and diversity and to take into account different insularities, to speak from the minor, and with this, perhaps, to disrupt the major. Islands are small in scale. That means that they can pass unnoticed and they can test. Glissant felt that the world is a reality to be constantly questioned, and islands can enable us to do that. Between the island and the continent, the archipelago is the space that preserves boundaries and openness, where contact does not simply imply fusion, which enables one to feel the place and the world simultaneously. Glissant calls it the schema of belonging and relation at the same time. We are here this week to think about Santa Clara Island, an island that has a specific history, an island that can easily enter into conversation with its island siblings elsewhere on the planet. An ocean without islands is unthinkable. In this project, Cristina Iglesias asks us, maybe even demands, that we look, we spend time with island limits. Her project links the minor to the major land, and with this embodies a site of possibilities. You arrive from the sea, you negotiate the rocks, and open with this an island conversation. Until recently, we thought about islands being first shaped by geological history, and second, by human history. In the last 50 years, we know human history can be the start. This project, Christina's project, looks to the darkness by focusing on a site that was made to beam out light. Lighthouses are very familiar to islands. They are there to guide sailors safely onto rocky shores. Perhaps it is the lack of obstacles that so delighted Lewis Carroll's mariners. But on islands, on these insular, defiant, rocky outcrops, so often there is a counter trade of piracy, where the lights are there to bring the unaware too close for safety. This project we are celebrating underlines the dialectical nature of islands. It celebrates them and it points to holding back from islands. This is a project that thinks with an island on its own terms, in its own language, and it opens a fissure to a possible future. And with this, we can all give our great thanks to Christina for encouraging us to think through the power of islands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Lefebvre. You have led us through a wonderful journey. Thank you. Don't go too far because we will be counting on you at the next round table. Bi egunetako lehenbiziko mahai inguruari hasiera emango diogu eta horretarako luxuzko moderatzaile bat dugu gurean. Él es Adolfo Uriarte, director del Patrimonio Natural y Cambio Climático del Gobierno Vasco. Licenciado en Geología por la Universidad del País Vasco, maestría en Ciencias y doctorado en Oceanografía por la Universidad de Southampton. Ha liderado y participado en numerosos proyectos, tanto a nivel nacional como internacional, en la especialización de sedimentología y morfodinámica. Autor de múltiples publicaciones científicas y técnicas nacionales e internacionales, es miembro del Consejo Asesor Vasco en Medio Ambiente del Gobierno Vasco, del Comité de Expertos de la Cátedra UNESCO para la Reserva de Urdaibai y miembro permanente de la Junta Directiva de la Conferencia Española de Ingenieros de Puertos y Costas. Eskerrik asko, txalo bero bat berarentzat mesedez.
Bueno, I've been taught to talk in English, and I would like to have a relaxed conversation now with some of the opponents, and I would like to invite Beatriz Herraiz, please. Manu, please come on. I'm going to introduce every one of you once you're sitting with me. Penelope, and please, Asier, sit with us. Okay, I'm going to start first thanking the organization, thanking especially Christina for the fantastic piece of work that we had this morning, the opportunity to see and to experience. More than see, we could hear, we could see, we could feel. I think it was a fantastic experience, definitely. And of course, thank you to the aquarium for hosting us here, and thank you to the university for this summer courses and the opportunity they are giving us today to try to start this conversation between science and art, that we think it's quite important. I mean, very, very quickly, we believe that as a scientist, as the scientist, we need from the art to try to express our needs, to try to express what we are creating, because in a way, scientists we create knowledge, but we don't know how to transfer this knowledge to the society. And this is the point where I think, and Lisa has given us some light about islands. For me, it was a completely discovery, and I have to admit that I'm a frequent visitor of the island of Santa Clara, but from now on I will look at the island with a completely different perspective. Anyway, and because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to start with introducing first Beatriz Herraiz. Beatriz Herraiz, I'm going to speak now in Spanish, sorry, just es la directora del Museo Vasco de Arte Contemporáneo en Vitoria-Gasteiz. Muchísimas gracias por estar hoy con nosotros y ya directamente te voy a hacer una pregunta. Has tenido la oportunidad de ver la obra de Cristina y además conoces el resto de las obras que existen en la bahía. ¿cómo crees tú que esa obra encaja primero en la isla y luego en todo el contexto de la ciudad de San Sebastián?
Bueno, yo lo primero dar las gracias también a Cristina por brindarnos esta oportunidad de estar aquí. Sé que llevamos mucho tiempo ya en la sala y bueno, no quiero repetirme, pero sí que quiero también subrayar que creo que hay pocos momentos o hay pocas oportunidades para que el mundo de la ciencia y el mundo del arte, que debieran ir de la mano mucho más de lo que acontece, pudiesen trabajar juntos. Bueno, creo que es una ocasión excepcional y bueno, reitero también lo que has ya comentado. Ha cambiado totalmente, por responder a tu pregunta directamente, la percepción que yo creo que todos vamos a tener de lo que existe en el contexto y de lo que ahora mismo está presente como escultura pública, pero no solamente como escultura pública. Yo creo que como ciudad, como espacio social y como lugar de encuentro de una experiencia. Yo creo que todos habéis estado hablando de la idea de experiencia desde muchos ámbitos. Yo conocía el proyecto, es un proyecto que todos nosotros hemos estado siguiendo en diferentes momentos y ayer tuve la oportunidad de visitar por primera vez la escultura y el espacio y el lugar. Creo que nadie se hace la idea hasta que está allí de lo que ha supuesto y sobre todo no se hace la idea porque creo que la escultura y el proyecto de Cristina va más allá de un mero objeto, trasciende esa idea de espacio y nos lleva a un lugar donde ya solamente la deriva a la que estás obligada a someterte, vamos a decir, para llegar a esa experiencia, pone al observador, a la persona que se acerca en un estado ya distinto, de excepción, al que no estamos acostumbrados. Creo que hay un trabajo con el tiempo, hay un trabajo con el espacio, hay un trabajo con el viaje, hay un trabajo con la arquitectura, con la naturaleza, que excede muchas veces o excede cualquier expectativa que podríamos tener. Desde la perspectiva o el campo del arte, evidentemente, es inevitable hacer esa comparación, ¿no? ¿Por qué Cristina decide? Porque además es un gesto, es una decisión, es una situación, situar esta pieza justamente entre Oteiza y Chillida, ¿no? Creo que este tercer punto en la bahía altera otras muchas cuestiones y creo que es fundamental que una escultora de la talla de Cristina Iglesias, que creo que es una de las artistas, bueno, pues diría que la artista más internacional que existe en el contexto, en España, y bueno, tenga un espacio como que ahora mismo ocupa en la bahía. Y creo que es importante también ponerlo en relación con las otras dos esculturas, porque yo creo que ha habido cuestiones que han surgido ya en esta mesa. Se ha hablado de las presentaciones previas de la idea de lo subterráneo, del búnker, de todo aquello que no se ve. Y creo que en el trabajo de Cristina esa idea de antimonumento, esa cuestión de lo que está escondido, de lo que nos obliga a prestar atención, a movernos en el espacio, prestar atención para buscar aquello que se está presentando, es muy importante. No miramos hacia arriba, miramos hacia abajo, cambia nuestra percepción, pero cambia nuestra percepción también de la ciudad. De repente se ve San Sebastián, se ve toda esa costa desde otro lugar. Creo que todos esos juegos son de difícil descripción. Creo que, como habéis dicho, es una experiencia. No me quiero alargar mucho, pero solamente quería dar una última cuestión que igual luego podemos ahondar en ella. Y es que me ha sorprendido cuando estaba escuchando a Lisa todo lo que existe en cuanto a referencias. Para mí ayer fue casi una tormenta de ideas, porque más allá, y por supuesto había miles de resortes que saltaban pensando en otras obras de artistas, pensando en Smith o en otras de las piezas que Penélope también ha mostrado, pero para mí era todo literatura, no podía dejar de pensar en libros, todo el rato pensaba en libros. Yo conocía el trabajo de Cristina Iglesias muy vinculado a la literatura, recuerdo su participación en la exposición de Roussel en el Reina Sofía, era algo que no podía desconectar de aquella experiencia, porque si bien no es una isla, al final el Locus Solus, que era el título de aquella exposición, es un jardín que está diseñado por un científico, estos cruces entre unos mundos y otros, un científico que se llamaba Marcial Caltarel, que daba vida a una serie de objetos y de seres que él había construido con una sustancia que se llamaba la resurrectina, que devolvía la vida a ciertos personajes, entre ellos un enorme, estoy describiendo el libro, que al final es una descripción tras otra descripción el libro, un enorme diamante que tenía dentro agua y había una bailarina que se iba moviendo. No podía despegarme de todas esas. Esta es una de todas las múltiples referencias. Bueno, creo que esos vínculos también con el texto, con la literatura, es algo que enriquece aún más este encuentro entre ciencia y arte. Y bueno, quizás faltaría también alguien del mundo literario, porque creo que es alguien que podría estar también aportando mucho. Sin más.
Muchísimas gracias, Beatriz. Bueno, a mi izquierda tengo a Manu Monge.
Monge no.
Manu Soto. Es la confianza, Manu Soto. Perdona. I'm going to change now into English because it's going to be easier if we change to English. He's a cell biology professor in the University of the Basque Country, and he's the deputy director as well of the Marine Station in Plencia. And we know each other for a long time.
Many years.
And by the way, he is as well co-directing with James and myself this course. And my question to you is quite straightforward. What does a cell biologist think about art, and how is it included in the way they're trying to express their work, their creations, or their knowledge creation to people?
Good question. When I first came into this adventure with you and with James and with Cristina and Lourdes and other people, I was thinking, come on, what I can afford to this link, to decipher this link between science and art, no? I thought, okay, science is not so far away from art. We are inspired by nature in many cases. In geology, as in the case of Asier, in my case, in biology. I'm a biologist. I'm not going to say 3 times, as Asier said. But I'm inspired since I was a child in nature, also geology. But as cell biologist, I study cells and small compartments within cells and molecular processes and physiological processes. And it's curiosity, as all of us we have in science and in art, looking at nature, looking at cells, trying to know which is the behavior of the cells regarding the pressure of the environment. I'm studying cells of aquatic animals, cells of mollusks, cells of fishes, of mussels in many cases, in oysters and so on, polychaetes, small worms living in the sediment. So it's quite, like you said, they are hidden. These cells are hidden in a cave, are hidden in a body, and we have to have a look. What are the tools that we use? We use microscopes, as also Asier used, to see the structure of the different geological formations and the different foraminifers and coccolithophorids and these kind of things. Like we go into, but all the cells, they don't have colors. Well, there are some cells that they've got pigment, like in our retin. That's the reason that we can see. But most of the cells of the animals, they don't have any color. So we need to paint them. We need to stain all these cells, because otherwise, if we put in the microscope, the light interacts with the object, but if the object is not colored, we cannot see anything. So we put different stains. We paint our cells with different colors. These colors can tell us how the morphology of the cell is. If it's tall, if it's small, if it's big, if it's thick, if it's thin. Also, we can know the composition of these cells applying different stainings based on histochemistry, on chemistry. And we can see how many proteins are in the cells, how many lipids are in the cells, how many DNA are in the cells, if the virus is coming into the cell or not. We can detect with the light microscope or using electrons in the electron microscope. And what is my idea? Trying to use this to know what's happening in nature, to know what is occurring in the environment, to know if there is some event that is affecting the health of the environment. How?
looking at the cells of the animals living in the environment. So I'm inspiring, like Christina in this case, in nature, to give a message of sustainability, a message of knowing, you have to know to protect. My motto is know to protect. Be inspiring nature to protect nature, as in different ways, as scientists like we are, and in, artists as you are. Okay. So I think this is the link. This is the good point of this symposium, trying to put together our interest in looking at life, looking at nature. So that's more or less my small contribution as a cell biologist. That nobody could expect that cell biologist is interested in these kind of things, but I am. So that's the idea. Link everything. We're not so far away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manu. Soto. Okay. Please, I know that there is a microphone somewhere there. Please, if you have got any questions in the audience, or if there are any questions in the ones that are looking in the streaming at their homes or offices, please give us, send us your questions, right? Is there any question in the audience that someone would like to raise, or I can make another one? I do not want to monopolize all the questions. Lisa, you have been talking about Anthropocene, and I know that Ilario this morning, earlier, has been talking about Anthropocene. What is the vision of Anthropocene from the art side, from the artistic side? What is it a positive or is it negative? How do you see it, Anthropocene?
That's a useful point to make. Is the Anthropocene positive or negative? I think it's neither. I think it's as a non-scientist, I think it's a description in the way that we talk about other geological eras. And our question in this version of the present is to think where we are and think how we might consider possible futures. So I would say it's simply a term, and maybe to return to what we were just talking about this interaction of science and art. I really firmly believe that art's purpose is the production of knowledge, to go beyond what we think we know. And of course, it's the same with science. It's to test and to experiment and to observe. So I think the Anthropocene is not a judgment term. It's merely description. We are where we are. And the question that we need to address is, what do we do from here? How do we think? How do we engage? How do we speak? How do we act? And perhaps it is so useful in this collision of these two disciplines of producing knowledge, art and science, that maybe we can push beyond the limits of the range. We can try something that we don't know any answers for.
Thank you, Lisa. Just a second, because I would like to have as well the answer of Ilario about Anthropocene, because you've mentioned it as well in your talk.
Well, I think Anthropocene, as Lisa said, it's a very interesting concept because of many reasons. Mainly because it's probably the best mirror, or it's like a mirror that it makes you wonder which is your role or which is our role in the planet. And it is also positive for I would say, the geological community, because at last, now we have some geological concept, which is a geological era, in the center of the discussion, or in an important part of the discussion, of the environmental discussion, which has been out of the discussion for a long time. But if we talk about Anthropocene as a geologist, as a member of the International Union of Geological Sciences, I have to say that Anthropocene, it's only an idea, it's only a concept. It's a good idea, it's a good concept, because it makes you wonder. But Anthropocene, it's not a geological era. It has not been accepted as a geological era, and this is important to point. The Earth, as I said this morning, the Earth is very old. It's 4,600 million years old. And geologists, we need to divide this time in different chapters. And we need to divide this time in different chapters according to different events that we can recognize in the rocks, in the sediments. We are talking about geological time. We are talking about geology. So we need to have sediments. We need to have rocks. It's not just a matter of behaving. The good point of, let's say, the global change that we are, let's say, provoking and suffering today is that we can measure the way the change is happening, because we have very good technology. But still, it's a very short time. Still, we don't have a geological record about this change. It is obvious that the change that is happening lately in the last decade, it's important. It's very strong. It's as strong as most of the most important changes that happened on Earth history. But still, it's very short. We don't have geological record. We don't have sediments, or we have a very few sediments. We don't have rocks that can tell us in the future. Let's think about in 5 million years' time. Let's think about in 10 million years' time. So, for example, this morning I talked about one of the most important warming events on Earth history. It happened 56 million years ago. And that lasted 50,000 years. And that is not considered as a geological era. It's just considered as an event that provokes a change from one era to the other. So let's say, from that point of view, Anthropocene is very positive because it's like a mirror, but somehow it's just an idea, and it's a quite egocentric idea. So from that point of view, again, we need to realize that we just arrived on Earth. What happened if now suddenly we get to use a good technology, and let's say in 1,000 years? That looks like very long, but it's a very short time. Or even in whatever, even in shorter time, we get to solve most of our most important environmental impacts, because we are going to have a different kind of life, different kind of technology, different kind of feeding. Everything is going to be different. So what will happen if we now decide to define a new geological era that will, let's say, delete the main record in just 1,000 years' time? So, well, Anthropocene is a good idea, it's a good concept, but from the geological point of view, it is not still acceptable. It's a good idea, but still it's a very short-time idea.
Thank you, Asier. Please, you can make your question.
Can you hear? Yeah.
Is it an open question, or you would like to direct it to someone?
I think anyone who would like to answer it, really, including Christine.
Please go on.
It's really about, you speak about the Anthropocene era, but one of the things that we also, I think, talk about a lot is human hubris, you know, and this sort of fatal pride that is also, as I said, I'm probably being very naive here because you're speaking about much, much longer geological phases. And we simply read in the newspaper every day about the 90% destruction of the coral reefs, or, you know, in a very, very short period of time, and sort of, we think a few decades. So what Christina's work that somehow reconciles the, let's say, the hubris of art, the artificiality of art, the presence of nature, and the promise of technology, because I see that all wrapped up in this sculpture and in much of her other work, but specifically the sculpture. But my question to all of you is to consider those very hard questions as well, you know, and the role of art, science, and humans.
Who wants to answer? Penelope, would you like to say something?
Well, I think it's very difficult because art, the good art is not didactic. So art cannot tell us something or teach us a lesson, I don't think, very often. But it maybe can change the way we think about something, but in a way that perhaps we can't exactly explain. And so we're asking art to do a lot, I think too much at this moment. I think we all agree it's a great piece of art, but it can't solve these problems that we're talking about. You know, that's a massive order. It might make some people think more closely about their natural heritage, perhaps. But I think other people will be transported to a very different place. So I always worry when people ask art to solve other questions.
I think
I wasn't saying asking art to solve this
No,
question.
not you. I just mean in general. The premise of the is kind of.
No, I think what I was trying to say was that I think that Christina's work actually is a fusion of all of these questions, but is certainly very provocative in terms of bringing both the positive and the destructive, because to me this sculpture in itself, it's a very menacing sculpture in many ways, with the way it's a vortex, you know. So what I was trying to say is it brings together all of these sort of Manichaean forces in a way, rather than only the optimism. So that was a little bit my question to all of you.
Yes, no, I didn't mean. I wasn't saying that. No, I find it impossible. I mean, what I wanted to ask was if you could just give us a quick translation of what you said, because there was no translation of your point.
Oh, right.
Okay.
And then to have a response from the artist, if we're allowed to ask the artist to respond.
To repeat what I've said.
Could you say very quickly what you said?
Okay, I will say it in Spanish again. Do you have the translation? No?
You say it in English.
I mean, that's difficult for me. No, I mean, just I went through many things, and when I talk, so he asked me, well, the question you had it, and the answer was that I think that the sculpture has changed completely the landscape of the city, but not only this idea of just placing a sculpture in between two other big names, but also the way that we approach that work. I mean, that it demands us to make an effort to think and to approach it in a different way, with a different time. You need to make an effort to take a boat to go there. And also this idea of it's not a monument, but just the opposite. I mean, the way that you approach, I mean, the gaze that you have to apply to the sculpture is not this way. This is the way that we are, I mean, you are talking about Childa Anotezo, but just the opposite. We need to see that this vortex that you have mentioned. And in this way, I think that maybe this is something just to answer what has been said in the audience, that I think there is this problem inside what you have just underlined, no? That she's not, there is a question. She's questioning the very idea of the sculpture, but also all those problematics that we are talking about, they are inside that. But I also went through other questions that I say that when I was in front of the sculpture, for me it was surprising to hear Lisa, because she was talking about books and writers and histories. And for me, I've been thinking on literature after visiting the sculpture in Santa Clara yesterday morning. Especially, it's not an island, but it's a garden. It is this book by Raymond Roussel, Locus Solus, where a scientist creates a sculpture, a garden of sculptures with these machines elevators that he injected with resurrectina. So there was something problematic also in the good sense, like she was questioning the very idea of nature, these contemporary problems that we are facing nowadays, and that's basically more or less.
Thank you very much.
May I say something regarding the coral reefs? That the disappearance of coral reefs is clear, but also I think art can help in recovering reefs. The corals, as we have seen in the video given by Lisa regarding the fine art of Cristina in the Mar of Cortés, is a nice idea. Also, we as scientists, I'm involved in a small project right now. We are looking for funding, trying to increase the biodiversity of the Bay of Plentia, introducing artificial reefs. And it has been also used for increased fisheries, increased fishing and these kind of things. So why not, instead of putting a big concrete, square concrete down in the bottom, put a fine art or the figure of something? That could be a link also to art and recovery of the damaged environments. Sorry.
Definitely, yeah. Are there questions in the audience? Okay, here there's one. Can you, who's got, okay. Yes, please.
Thank you, everyone, for all your contributions, which have been fascinating. And I'm not sure if this subject may be dealt with tomorrow, but I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about the location of the work inside a lighthouse. So the subject of light and safety, the safety of avoiding danger, of hitting the rocks, of being inside a domestic, somewhat domestic dwelling, living that life, and the whole history in this area of shipbuilding, navigation, living on the sea, and then, of course, as Penelope was exploring earlier, in art history, the richness of light and dark as a way of seeing and being.
Thank you, thank you. I think it's a very nice message, and I'm sure that saving lives, that was the main objective of lighthouses in the future, could be translated as well into save a little bit nature, save our natural heritage. I think it's a nice point, and
I think one of the issues that seems to be emerging is the contrast between something that is damaged and something that is repaired. And I think for me, I was trying to talk about a bit the idea of a place that restores you, and that's a spring is a place that restores you, and also to hint at the female connection to that, which goes back a long way. But and this question we have now of the kind of damage to nature, and then recuperation, I think it links a little bit to this project. And as I understand it, the island was also a place of quarantine, no? Mm-hmm. In the medieval period. Yeah. So this idea of a disease, a place of disease, but also a place of sanctuary, is a big contrast. And we've talked a lot about the natural history of the coast, but we haven't talked so much about the historical story of this island. And it would be nice also, because as an outsider, I don't know how much this was part of the story of San Sebastián as a plague island.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Maybe I'm sure people here must know the answer.
Cristina,
yeah.
I'm sure.
Yes, Cristina, please.
Well, hello. I don't know. I mean, there is a history of the island, but I think for me, what was important, like Lisa has so beautifully made, is such links to literature and other pieces of art that refer to islands. And I think in my work, not only in this work, but in general, that actually connects with your reference also to Virilio and the bunkers, is the fact of also an island, a place where can be a refuge. And it's true that it was a place historically for disease, I mean, people to be isolated from, with lepra, I don't know how you say that in English. And but now in more poetic terms, or let's say contemporary to our time, it can be a place to go. I mean, to find a refuge, but also to find yourself, somehow. And that's something that art can offer somehow, if you have time to look at it, and also nature does. And referring to this cross between science and art, I think the lighthouse, I mean, art can also bring light to issues that actually are being more let's say, the el campo de batalla. I mean, the fight is with the scientists that really do the work, but artists, maybe sometimes we can create dialogues or bring light to issues that have to be lightened, and that's why I chose also as an artist and as a sculptor to use such place. I was not thinking at all, of course, it sounds naive, but I was not thinking about, at that time, about Chillida and Oteiza, so the historical sculptures that are on both sides of the bay. I was thinking in the island, and I was thinking being able to maybe do that bronze cave, that abyss, inside the lighthouse on the island, in the island. So that was something that, and to create a tempest inside. So all those things together talk about also the abstraction of the language of art, which is not about giving answers, it's always about questioning and bringing light, maybe to look at something.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, can't see any people wanting to ask. Any other thing that you would like to add to the possibility of how, if there are any keystones that we haven't touched in terms of how we can connect better and try to explain better our feelings. I mean, I know Hilario and his talk, well, and of course the artist, they when they express themselves from the very bottom of their heart. You see that it's coming out from the guts, really, what they are saying, because we believe in what we do. We love what we do. And I think that at some point we miss the contact with the rest of the people. Not only scientists, I think artists as well. Because usually, I mean, and I say it, sometimes they say, well, this is an artist, like he's a little bit out of his mind, or it's out of what we, like what humans or normal people would talk about, right? We're always thinking in different concepts, in a different way. And I think, and my feeling is as well, that the society has got the same perspective from scientists. So we are something like strange people that they're doing their own things. They're in the lab, and well, leave them.
No, but this has changed over the last year.
It is changing slowly.
No, but with COVID, it's really changed.
Yeah.
I think people now, they see scientists very regularly, and they trust them more than politicians.
Okay, and the big question is now: do you think this situation is going to last in the future, or we are going to forget it again after a few years, and we are going to go back into 2019, when we didn't have the COVID, and people would go back to what they thought about science and about many other things?
I don't think people think scientists are mad at all. They just think they don't understand them.
And do you think they understand art and artists?
No, many people say the same.
Yeah.
So we have to help each other.
Yes.
Definitely. We need to make a big team between art and science, and go back probably to the 19th century, or the 18th century, or even further, when we talk about people from Renaissance or the Renacimiento, no? People that were like Leonardo da Vinci. They were sculptors, they were painters, they were, of course, engineers, architects, inventors. People, I mean, let's go back and join again and try to make something together.
Do your students have questions? Because your students are following this, no?
Yeah.
Do they have no questions?
No questions.
No questions?
No. Not through the chat. I have been checking from time to time.
This is not a good sign.
Yeah.
Maybe if I may just respond to that conversation, I really don't think that artists and scientists are seen as being outside of society in a general way. Perhaps the gap between someone who is outside of the realm of art or outside of the realm of science is that these two disciplines, the the activity, the business of these two disciplines is to try and wrestle with ideas that we do not have words for, so that both art and science comes in advance of fixed language, fixed articulation, and that's why it's so important. And I really feel with the marrow in my bones that we have a responsibility to make sure that we never set art and science outside of society, because it is society. And I think it's a kind of an old-fashioned, a retrospective, retrogressive even, idea of thinking about this difference. If art and science are not fundamental to society, then it means what we do is not relevant. And we can see through history, through the incredible presentations that I've watched through my screen today and through Christina's work, that this matters. It is not on the outside, it's on the inside, and we're struggling to raise questions and to test and experiment in some way.
Thank you, Lisa.
I have one more question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Which is to Ilario and Cristina, about how do the two of you discuss time together? Because Ilario is speaking about millions of years, and Cristina has to make an artwork in a very short period of time, in a very compressed period of time, and I would love to know how you talk to each other about that.
Well, we did talk some words today, and well, my feeling is that she's been able to, in a very short time, as you said, but she's been able. Well, when I went to the island, when I went to the lighthouse, as I said, I think during the lunch, I focused more on the solid part of the sculpture and not that much on the water, and because that's what I like. So my eyes go directly to the rock, to the stone, to the way in which this rock has been eroded. And I think that she's been able to do it in a short time, but she's been able to show, I would say, the deepness of time, how the water through time, but you need time, but the water through time, the sea, the erosion of the sea on the rock through time has been able to produce this kind of fantastic, beautiful things. So I really like it. I think that I had very much the feeling of the time, which I cannot explain very well how it is, but I had the feeling of the deep time when I was looking at the sculpture, and I think that this is something that I really have to welcome, because it's not easy to get that feeling, especially in let's say an artificial thing. When you are in front of a big mountain, as I said this morning, that's what's happening. But in an artificial thing like this, being able to transmit this concept of time, it's fantastic, and I think you've been able to do it.
Yeah. But related to that, actually, one of the questions, I didn't know if I can make it to Cristina, if it's too pretentious, but how do you think it's your sculpture gonna evolve in time? Are you looking at your in 50 years time or 100 years time? How is your sculpture being? How is it evolving? Have you thought about it?
I normally don't think in those terms, in these lengths, but it's true that referring to what Asier just said, time is in the memory of what I represented, which is not, of course, the reality, is a fiction, and time is also involving the movement of water in the sequence I have created. So it's about looking, and it's about the perception you get of time in that looking, and the memory you come with and you live with, and to travel there and come back. How these will live in time is a question that also we don't know. We have a problem with in the world, with the global warming, and with how if we will have enough water in 1,000 years, so all those questions, I mean, are the ones that we have to think about, and it involves everything. Probably maybe the piece will still be there because it has become a place, as we were saying before, where people go to feel it and just to have the journey and back. But yeah, I mean, that's the way I think on it. I'm not I mean, I think it's important for me because it's a responsibility with the landscape, what I've done, and there is always, with all the artists that work in the landscape, there is a responsibility, even if it disappears, like Smithson Spiral Jetty and appears again. And all that is to work with nature and to work with time. And I think I'm aware of that. I was when I did it, but I don't think what will happen I think that's open to nature, actually, and to the people.
Yeah, and I've got sorry, yes. Oh, yes, James, please.
I have one question for Ilario, which is, if the Anthropocene goes on for long enough to become more of a
geological era,
and you project yourselves millions of years into the future, and you describe geology as a line, what will the line of the Anthropocene look like to a geologist?
Well, I can answer that because I'm here.
No, I'm asking you to predict.
But the thing is that if you go to the future, let's say in 5 million times, and in order to be able to answer that question, you need to have a geological record. And that's still what we don't know, if it will happen or not, or how it will happen. And that's a very interesting question, even from a philosophical point of view. But now that we are here and we can measure which is the change, I mean, the change is as strong as it was the 5th big mass extinction, for example, or it is as strong as it was the Paleocene thermal maximum. So really the change is as strong as the most important changes of Earth history. So probably what we will see is that in a very short time, in a very short period of time, most of the biota would have disappeared in the same way that it happened 65 million years ago. What we will see is that probably some isotopes, like the carbon or oxygen isotopes, will give some ideas of change of the temperature, of the salinity of the water. So I mean, the changes are real. The question now is how those changes are going to be recorded in the sediments, in rocks, and that's what the, let's say, scientific community is working on, just to try to prove that there is enough record to let's say, to establish this geological era. But even if they would be able to demonstrate that there is enough record, geological record, sediments and rocks, we're talking about geology, so sediments and rocks. So even though we have to think about time. So what if we, what I said before, what if we in 500 years, which is a long time, so in 1,000 years, which is a long time, we have no idea what our society will be in 1,000 years' time. So let's say let's say 1,000 years. What if we have changed our way of life? If we have, let's say, delete all this bad record that we have left in the last decades. So from the geological point of view, it would have been like nothing, like absolutely nothing. So that's the debate nowadays in the scientific community. It's a very interesting debate. Not only scientific, but it's from every point of view, it's a very interesting debate.
May I say, I add something? For example, I think that the records are needed, but now Fukushima, for example, the isotopes raised from Fukushima are used for datation. No? So can be used, because Anthropocene is the period in which the effect of the human being is more marked.
Yeah.
So now Fukushima isotopes are, as you explained with the extinction of the dinosaurs, the Fukushima isotopes are all over the
sediment.
The sediment.
That's
can be used, maybe, I don't know.
That was proposed to be used.
Yeah.
Well, not Fukushima, but another big
nuclear explosion.
Yeah.
Or
that was proposed to be used because it can be dated in sediments all around the world. So that was proposed to be used as the beginning of the Anthropocene, because every geological era that has to be defined has to be global.
Yeah.
So it has to be, so let's say the industrial evolution doesn't work because it doesn't happen at the same time in different parts of the world. Yeah. But that isotopical record happens in the same time in different parts of the world. So that was proposed to be, let's say, the beginning of the Anthropocene. So that's not the problem that much. The problem is that we need to have not only a starting point, which we could use that one because there is a signal, but we need to have a record of sediments during the period. So it's not just having a starting line. So then we need to have a record of sediments that must be different from the ones of the previous stage. Okay. So and that's the point now. So well, it's really a very interesting debate.
Yeah.
But the strange thing about this sculpture is that to pick up on the previous point, it's a contemporary snapshot of something that happened many millions of years ago. I'm just wondering now, is it conceivable that the sculpture could outlive the source from which it was cast? If there was a landslip or something happened to the coastline, the sculpture would document something that had disappeared?
Well, let's hope
not. We've just opened it.
Yes, I don't know.
Well, somehow the sculpture has recorded very well something that happened, let's say, like 40 million years ago at 1,000 meters deep under the sea. And then, let's say, nothing happened for a long time, through, let's say, 30 million years. And then it has recorded very well how during the last thousands of years, but just thousands of years, a couple of thousands of years, the wind and the salinity and the sea have eroded that big landslide of sand that happened 40 million years ago, have eroded in such a particular way, such a specific way. So yes, it records very well two different moments of time.
Because I'm thinking in art terms that, as I mentioned briefly, the casts in the Victoria and Albert Museum of the Roman monuments that were cast in the 19th century, now the casts are better than the original. So this is a bigger.
Yeah, I understand.
It's going to be difficult. It's better than the original. Yeah. Anyway, we've got another question in the audience, please.
Yes, to Asir, I think. Isn't it true that the Anthropocene is being transferred or taken to Mars? Because there are many artists that who are working on this idea of making like an experiment of Anthropocene in Mars, because maybe in the future we will have to live there.
But well, I think I didn't get the real question. So
excuse me.
Excuse me, the mic.
Sorry. Mr. Point.
Hay una exposición ahora en Barcelona que es sobre Marte.
Sí,
en la última parte hay un apartado donde se ven las obras de artistas que colaboran con científicos en torno a la idea de hacer el experimento del antropoceno en Marte. Es decir, que no tendremos más remedio dentro de 40 años, no mucho más lejos, nos habremos cargado el planeta entonces, pero ya es urgente que empecemos a experimentar o crear un laboratorio en la Tierra de cómo podremos vivir o sobrevivir en el planeta. Y hay muchos artistas que están dando ideas. Entonces, no sé saber simplemente, en fin, cómo lo enfocáis los geólogos, o si sois tan pesimistas, no sé.
No. Well, I think geologists are not. It's not a matter of being optimistic or being pessimistic. Well, I really don't want to think that we will have to live to another planet. I mean, it's just a common sense. So we need to rethink how we want to be here. So there is no other way. I mean, we need to rethink how we want to be, let's say, good people, a better people, I have a better society. And so just here, this is already too complicated. I don't want to think about Mars, or I don't want to think about other planets. Even I think it's a good. I mean, it's a good idea to play, but go into reality. We need to establish real policies to have a better future, to have a more sustainable future, from the local point of view and from the global point of view. But just thinking in our planet, not nothing else than that. That's my point of view.
Lo que quería decir es que, it exists, the collaboration between artists and scientists. So it's not that they think that maybe we can live in this on the Earth, but just in case, science are ready to. Scientists are ready to think of this possibility, and they are asking for new ideas to artists. So it is happening. So they think that we can translate the Anthropocene on the Earth to another planet. It's nothing that it's not that I am thinking of this stupid idea. It's that they are doing that.
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult right now because we have already sent one mission to Mars. It's known people there. There are some vehicles. Also, our university is taking part in this kind of a project. But I don't foresee that a human being is going to be installed in Mars for many, many years. I think it's more a thing of science fiction more than reality. Also, as I said, we can play, we can discuss, and we can think in everything. But now, I don't think it's feasible right now because we are exploring the surface of the planet. We are just exploring the surface. We don't know nothing about the geology of Mars inside. If there is water, there is no water, there is ice, how much is there, the atmosphere. We need information. As I said before, we need to know. We need to know to react. We need to know to protect. I don't think we should export our bad habits to another planet, because we have been doing very bad here in the Earth, no? So it's difficult for me to understand that we are going to export our bad habits. It's my opinion.
Okay, Carlos, we've got please.
Thank you. So I'm very much enjoying this question period, and then I was going to link to something that Lisa and Cristina mentioned, and it's about art as a way of posing questions, not providing answers. And we've been discussing earlier what is the link between scientists and science and art, and there's creative thinking. But in my opinion, the important point, and what I tell to communicate to my students, is that the important role for scientists is to pose questions, and to pose questions that have not been posed before. And the answers are actually of secondary interest. Once you pose the question, you already set up a path, and that path is a new quest for light and a new quest for a lighthouse. So I think that posing the questions is what brings us together. And I've been thinking about what question is it that Cristina has posed to us, and I'll share my thought tomorrow about what is it that I thought the question was.
Thank you, Carlos. I don't know if we should be coming to an end. Yes, I've got some people saying. So,
out of time.
Yeah, out of time. Lisa, thank you very much. I see that you have managed to feed your birds. For God's sake, feed them.
Hear them. They're very, very noisy.
Was quite a bit noisy. Anyway, thanks you very much for being here today. And I know you had to wake up early. It's quite early there in California, so thanks a lot for joining. Thanks to the rest of the group here joining me today, and it was really an honor for me, and of course having Cristina and James and the whole group. Thank you very much, and I hope you have enjoyed it.